Robert Chambers. He looked like exactly the kind of young man New York society wanted to believe in. He had come up through the city's private schools. He carried himself with an easy, courteous manner, and he had the sort of face that made strangers assume the best about him. But when an 18-year-old woman left an Upper East Side bar with him one August night, she never made it home, and the account he gave of how she died would divide the city for years. Robert Chambers Jr. was born in the autumn of 1966 and raised largely by his mother, a nurse who worked hard to place him among the children of the wealthy. He attended a string of elite preparatory schools, some of them on scholarship, and he learned early how to move through rooms full of privilege as though he had always belonged there. Beneath that polished surface, though, was a young man already building a quiet record of petty theft and credit card fraud. By the summer of 1986, he was 19 years old and a familiar face at Dorian's Red Hand, a bar on the Upper East Side where the children of Manhattan's elite liked to gather. Jennifer Levin was 18. She had recently moved from Long Island into her father's home in Soho, and she moved easily through that same circle of bars and late nights. She had begun talking about a future in fashion and design. On the night everything changed, she and Chambers left Dorian's together in the early morning hours. Later that morning, her body was found behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art near the edge of Central Park, her clothing disturbed. She had been fatally harmed, and the medical evidence pointed to strangulation. When detectives reached Chambers at his home, they found deep scratches across his face and neck. Without a lawyer present, he agreed to a videotaped statement, and in it, he offered the explanation that would define the case. He claimed Levin had died by accident during rough physical intimacy, and that she had been the one hurting him. That explanation turned the case into a national sensation. The suggestion that a young woman's own conduct might have caused her death struck many people as an outrage, and the coverage was relentless, feeding a public appetite for every detail of the wealthy young crowd Chambers belonged to. His lawyers presented him as a troubled young man caught up in a terrible accident. Prosecutors argued the opposite, that a privileged defendant was leaning on a version of events almost impossible to disprove. So how does a case with a young woman gone behind a museum and a suspect wearing her marks on his face end without a jury ever reaching a verdict? Chambers was charged with second-degree murder, and the press quickly gave the story a name that stuck: the Preppy murder. His defense attorney, Jack Littman, was known for aggressive tactics, and he mounted a strategy that put the victim's private life on trial nearly as much as the defendant's conduct, an approach that drew public anger, even as it seemed to reach some of the jurors. That videotaped statement became the centerpiece of the proceedings, played for the jury as both sides argued over whether the death had been an accident or something far more deliberate. The jurors deliberated for 9 days, and as word spread that they were badly deadlocking, prosecutors and the defense reached an agreement rather than gamble the entire case on a verdict that might never come. Chambers pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter, along with a burglary count, and in the spring of 1988, he was sentenced to a term of 5 to 15 years. Facing the Levin family in the courtroom, he told them he was sorry for the pain his actions had brought them. He would serve every year of that maximum term. 5 separate times he came up for parole, and 5 separate times he was refused, in part because of his conduct inside prison, which included drug possession and an assault on a corrections officer. He was finally released in early 2003, having served the full 15 years, and by then he was in his mid-30s. Freedom did not change him. Within a few years, he was arrested again, this time for running a cocaine operation out of his apartment, and in 2008, he was sentenced to 19 years on charges of selling a controlled substance and second-degree assault. The 19-year drug term was, in fact, longer than the sentence he had served for the death of Jennifer Levin. As of 2026, Robert Chambers is not behind bars at all. He was released on parole in the summer of 2023 after serving 15 years on that drug case, and he remains under supervision until 2028. One of the most infamous names of 1980s New York is, for now, a free man in his late 50s. Chambers came out of a world built more on social polish than on deep family wealth. The two brothers in the case that follows had real money at the center of their lives, and that fortune became the very thing prosecutors said they were willing to spill blood over. Eric and Lyle Menendez. In a Beverly Hills mansion in the late summer of 1989, a wealthy entertainment executive and his wife were harmed fatally in their own den. For months afterward, their two sons told the police they believed organized crime had come for the family. What investigators slowly came to understand was that the people responsible had been inside the house the entire time. And more than 35 years later, the country still cannot agree on why they did it. The brothers were Lyle Menendez, born in early 1968, and Eric Menendez, born near the end of 1970. They had grown up inside real wealth. Their father, Jose Menendez, was a Cuban-American executive who had climbed to the top of a home entertainment company, and by the time of his death, his estate was worth roughly $14 million. Lyle had attended Princeton, and Eric was a serious competitive tennis player. From the outside, the family behind the gates of that mansion looked like a portrait of success. Jose Menendez was 45, a self-made man with a reputation for being demanding and controlling. His wife, Mary Louise Menendez, known to everyone as Kitty, was 47, a former beauty queen who had set aside her own ambitions to raise their sons. On the evening of August 20th, 1989, the two of them were sitting together in the den of their home. Neither would survive the night. Using shotguns, the brothers took both their parents' lives, leaving more than a dozen wounds between them. In the hours that followed, they told investigators they suspected the mafia had carried out the attack, perhaps over something tied to their father's business. For a time, that story held. But their behavior in the weeks afterward began to draw notice. The brothers spent extravagantly, buying Rolex watches, a Porsche, a Jeep, even backing a restaurant, moving through money at a pace that struck people as strange for two grieving sons. The break finally came when Eric confided the truth to his psychologist, Jerome Oziel. Oziel repeated it to his mistress, and she was the one who ultimately carried what she knew to the police. But was this a cold calculation to seize an inheritance, or the breaking point of two sons who insisted they had endured years of abuse? That single question turned their case into one of the most closely watched trials in American history, broadcast to a national audience gripped by the spectacle of privilege gone wrong. Before it could reach a jury, though, the two sides fought over whether Eric's private admissions to his psychologist could even be used, a legal battle that reached into the confidentiality between a patient and a therapist. When the first proceedings did go forward, across 1993 and 1994, each brother had his own jury, and both juries ended in deadlock. Their lead defense attorney, Leslie Abramson, argued that the brothers had acted out of years of physical and sexual abuse at their father's hands. Prosecutors countered that the true motive was greed, a plain desire to inherit the family fortune. When the two were retried together across 1995 and 1996, the jury convicted them both of first-degree murder, and they were sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. For decades, that looked like the final word. Then, in the autumn of 2024, the Los Angeles district attorney at the time, George Gascon, recommended that the brothers be resentenced, citing new support for their abuse claims, including a letter Eric had written to his cousin Andy Cano back in 1988, months before the deaths. Supporters argued the letter corroborated what Eric had said for years about life inside that house. His successor in that office, Nathan Hochman, took the opposite view and opposed the effort, and the fight over resentencing became a public struggle in its own right. Even so, in May of 2025, a judge resentenced both men to 50 years to life, a change that made them immediately eligible for parole under a law covering offenders who were young when they committed their crimes. That August, in two separate hearings that each ran close to 10 hours, the parole board denied them both. One commissioner told Eric that two things could be true at once: that his family could love and forgive him, and that he could still be found unsuitable for release. The board's decision keeps the brothers confined until at least 2028. Weeks later, a judge rejected their bid for a new trial, and the governor's separate review of the case remained unresolved into the following year. As of 2026, Lyle and Eric Menendez remain incarcerated together at a correctional facility near San Diego. Their next opportunity for parole will not arrive until 2028. More than 3 decades after that night in Beverly Hills, the brothers remain behind bars, their fight for release still unresolved. The Menendez brothers were born directly into their fortune. The young man at the center of the next story was handed a different kind of privilege, the golden path of the star college athlete, and for years the people around him chose to look past the warning signs. George Hughley V. He was an all-American athlete from one of Maryland's wealthiest enclaves, a young man who seemed to have every door in life held open for him. His family owned vacation homes, and his talent on the lacrosse field had carried him into the University of Virginia. Yet running beneath that charmed life was a current of alcohol and aggression that the people around him seemed willing to overlook. By the spring of 2010, that current would carry away a bright young woman who was only weeks from finishing her degree. George Hughley V was born in the autumn of 1987 and grew up in Chevy Chase, Maryland, the product of an affluent family and a well-known private school. His athleticism eventually earned him a place on the men's lacrosse team at the University of Virginia, but those who spent time around him had watched his drinking curdle into something harder to ignore, and at a party earlier that same year, friends had seen him put his hands around the throat of the very woman he would later be accused of harming. Yeardley Love had grown up in Cockeysville, Maryland, and played midfield for the women's lacrosse team at the University of Virginia, wearing the number 1. She was an English major, and she stood just weeks away from graduation. For roughly 2 years, she had been in an on-and-off relationship with Hughley, one increasingly shadowed by his drinking, and by the spring of 2010, she had ended it. On the 3rd of May, 2010, after a day that had included heavy drinking and a father-son golf outing, Hughley forced his way into Love's off-campus apartment, kicking a hole through her bedroom door. What happened inside that room left her fatally harmed, and she was found a short time later by a roommate, who called the police at around 2:15 in the morning. Before he left, Hughley took her laptop computer with him, a detail that would matter later in court. The medical examiner would testify that Love had suffered blunt force trauma resulting in a fatal brain injury. Hughley admitted he had been there and that there had been physical contact between them. But he insisted he had not realized she had died, and he later claimed he could not remember much of what had taken place. How does a young man with everything ahead of him, a scholarship, a family fortune, a future, end up standing trial for the death of the woman he had once dated? Hughley was charged with first-degree murder, and his trial opened in February of 2012. Prosecutors argued that his forcing his way through that door, in the middle of a day soaked in alcohol, showed a man in control of his choices, while the defense pressed the idea that the death had never been meant to happen, that it was the tragic result of a drunken confrontation that spiraled beyond anyone's intent. His lawyers leaned heavily on his level of intoxication and the gaps in his memory, asking the jury to see recklessness instead of a deliberate plan. Witnesses described the earlier party where he had put his hands to Love's throat, painting a pattern of aggression that stretched back months. After weighing the evidence, the jury convicted him of second-degree murder and of grand larceny. The larceny count tied to the laptop he had taken, and it recommended a sentence of 26 years. That August, following a separate sentencing hearing, the judge formally imposed a term of 23 years, along with 1 concurrent year for the larceny. One of the prosecutors summed up the case plainly, saying there was nothing but loss everywhere a person looked. Over the following years, Hughley pursued appeals, challenging aspects of how his trial had been conducted, and each effort failed, including one that reached a federal appellate court. His conviction stood. The story did not end in the criminal courtroom. Love's family also brought a civil suit, one that had originally sought tens of millions of dollars in damages, and in May of 2022, a jury in Charlottesville awarded $7.5 million each to Love's mother, Sharon, and her sister, Lexi, a total of $15 million. The significance was not only the size of the award. Because the jury found that Hughley's conduct had been willful and wanton, rather than merely careless, the judgment cannot be erased through bankruptcy, and it will follow him for the rest of his life. For a family that had lost a daughter and a sister weeks before her graduation, the verdict added a further layer of accountability on top of the criminal case. As of 2026, George Hughley V remains incarcerated in Virginia. The earliest he could possibly be released is May of 2030. For a young man who once had every advantage, the years ahead are measured out inside a state prison. Hughley's advantages came straight from his own family and his own name. The young man in the next case lived a different arrangement, moving through a world of wealth and access that technically belonged to somebody far more famous. James Rackover and Lawrence DeLeon. Joseph Comunale met a group of strangers at a Manhattan club one November night and decided to go with them to an after-party in a luxury high-rise. He was 26 years old, a college graduate out for a good time in the city. Within hours, he was gone, and the man whose apartment he had walked into turned out to be the surrogate son of a jeweler who counted some of the most famous names in the world among his clients. James Rackover had been born James Baudouin, but he had become the informal, adopted son of the celebrity jeweler Jeffrey Rackover, taking the older man's name and living in a luxury tower on the Upper East Side. His benefactor's client list reportedly included figures like Oprah Winfrey and Jennifer Lopez, and the younger Rackover lived comfortably inside a world of money and access that was not truly his own. Alongside him that night was Lawrence DeLeon, a man in his late 20s from Jersey City, New Jersey. Neither of them had any real quarrel with the young man who would join their party, which is part of what made what happened so difficult to comprehend. And yet, within a matter of hours, what began as a party would put both of them at the center of one of the city's most disturbing cases. Joseph Comunale was 26, a young man from Stamford, Connecticut, and a graduate of Hofstra University. He had crossed paths with the group by chance, a stranger folded into their night out. He was the kind of young man who trusted easily and followed a good night wherever it went, and on this occasion it carried him up to a high-rise apartment full of people he barely knew. He had no reason to think the after-party would be anything other than that. On the 13th of November, 2016, inside Rackover's apartment during a gathering fueled by drugs and alcohol, Comunale was attacked and fatally injured. Rather than call for help, the men set about hiding what they had done. They moved his body out of the building in the pre-dawn hours and drove it across state lines to Oceanport, New Jersey, where they burned it and buried it in a shallow grave. apparently believing distance and fire would keep it from ever being connected back to them. That belief did not survive contact with a determined investigation. Comunale's father, unable to reach his son, reported him missing, and once the police began looking, the pieces came together with unusual speed. A resident in the building had already called emergency services after seeing a man dragging a heavy bag out into the night. Detectives searching the apartment brought in canine units, which detected human blood, and forensic testing turned up more of it on clothing and bedding. Toll pass records and license plate readers then traced Rackover's car along its route out to New Jersey and back. 3 days after Comunale vanished, his body was recovered from that shallow grave, and the story the men had counted on staying buried was suddenly in the open. How much is a life worth to men who treat another person as something to be wrapped up and carried away in the dark? The legal reckoning fell hardest on Rackover. Through the investigation, the men gave shifting accounts, each trying to shape the story of who had done what and to push the heaviest blame onto the other. But the physical evidence and the trail of the car left little room to hide. When Rackover stood trial in November of 2018, a jury convicted him of second-degree murder, along with concealing a human corpse and tampering with evidence. The following month, a judge handed him a sentence of 28 2/3 years to life, the maximum the law allowed. DeLeone took a different route, pleading guilty in January of 2019 to first-degree manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 23 years. A third man, Max Gemma, who had a lesser role in what followed the death, pleaded guilty to hindering prosecution and received a term of 6 months. All the money surrounding that Upper East Side tower had done nothing to soften the outcome. As of 2026, James Rackover is held at Elmira Correctional Facility in upstate New York, and the earliest he could be released is the summer of 2045. Lawrence DeLeone is confined at Clinton Correctional Facility, with an earliest possible release in early 2037. Max Gemma completed his short sentence and walked free in 2019. For the two men most responsible, the decades now stretch far out ahead of them. And for the Comunale family, none of it returns the young man who went out one November night expecting nothing more than a party, and instead met his death at the hands of people who barely knew him. Rackover's privilege was borrowed from a famous name. The next young man in this stretch of cases had privilege that was entirely real, entirely his own family's, and the thing that set him off was not a rivalry or a stranger, but the size of the check his parents were still writing him every week. Thomas Gilbert Jr. He had a Princeton degree, a trust-funded lifestyle, and parents who paid for nearly everything: his rent, his cars, his country club memberships, even a weekly allowance. What he did not have was a job. And when that allowance was finally cut back, something in him turned. One winter afternoon, he arrived unannounced at his parents' Manhattan apartment, sent his mother out on a small errand, and by the time she returned, his father was gone. Thomas Gilbert Jr. had graduated from Princeton with a degree in economics, and in the years afterward, the press would come to call him the Golden Boy, a young man who looked like he had everything. In truth, he was unemployed and financially dependent, his life underwritten almost entirely by his parents, who covered his rent of roughly $2,400 a month, his cars, his club memberships, and a weekly allowance on top of it all. Yet the polished exterior hid a growing instability. He had drifted through his adult life without holding down steady work. His behavior had grown more troubling to those around him, and his relationship with his father had frayed as the money that held it together came under strain. By his early 30s, that arrangement had curdled into a deep and simmering resentment. Thomas Gilbert Sr. was 70 years old, a Wall Street figure who had founded his own hedge fund Wainscott Capital Partners. He had built a life of real accomplishment and real money, exactly the kind of father whose success held doors open for his son. And it was that same son who arrived at his door with a plan. On the 4th of January 2015, Gilbert Jr. came unannounced to his parents' apartment in the Turtle Bay area of Manhattan. He asked his mother, Shelley, to go out and buy him a Coca-Cola. While she was gone, he took his father's life at close range with a .40 caliber handgun, then arranged the weapon in his father's hand in an effort to make it look self-inflicted. Prosecutors would later argue the motive was rage over that allowance, which had recently been reduced from around $1,000 a week down to just $300. When Shelley returned and discovered what had happened, she called the police. That small errand, sending his mother out for a soda moments before, would become a crucial detail. One jurors used to conclude that Gilbert had understood exactly what he was doing. Can a man who plans that carefully, who clears the room before he acts, truly claim he was not in command of his own mind? That was the question at the heart of his trial. Gilbert was charged with second-degree murder and weapons counts, and his defense argued that he was legally insane at the time, pointing to a documented history of mental illness that had troubled him for years and shaped the way he saw his father. The insanity claim was not a simple one, because the law does not treat every mental illness as a defense. What matters is whether the accused understood the nature of the act and knew that it was wrong. Prosecutors rejected the framing entirely, describing Gilbert instead as a man who had thrown the ultimate tantrum the moment his money was threatened, and they leaned on the deliberate way he had cleared the apartment, staged the scene, and slipped away. The case had already been marked by long delays and by his own conduct in the courtroom, and it was not until June of 2019 that the jury convicted him of second-degree murder and 2 counts of criminal possession of a weapon. That September, when the time came for sentencing, the judge imposed the maximum available term of 30 years to life and did not soften the message that came with it, telling Gilbert directly that he had known exactly what he was doing, that he had not been insane at the time and was not insane now. His defense signaled its intent to appeal, but no appeal has overturned the conviction, which still stands. As of 2026, Thomas Gilbert Jr. is held at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, and he will not be eligible for parole until sometime in the 2040s. In a prison interview aired in May of 2026, his first since his conviction, he continued to insist he was innocent, arguing that the accepted account of the case had left out important facts and misjudged the man at the center of it. Whatever a viewer makes of that claim, the conviction still stands, along with the maximum sentence that came with it. What set Thomas Gilbert off was the shrinking of an allowance, the fury of a young man who could not stand to see the money turned down to a trickle. The next young man was not angry about an allowance at all. He had set his sights on the entire family fortune, and he had decided he was not willing to wait for it to come to him. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Andrew Walmsley. On a December night in 2003, an upper-class couple in the suburbs of Fort Worth were attacked inside their own home, and at first, the scene looked like a burglary that had turned deadly. It would take investigators the better part of a year to understand that the person who had set the whole thing in motion was not a stranger at all. He was the couple's own son, and he had done it for an inheritance he was not willing to wait for. Rick and Susanna Walmsley were a well-established couple in Mansfield, Texas, a comfortable suburb southeast of Fort Worth. They had built the kind of prosperous, settled life that came with a substantial home and an estate worth well over $1 million. They had 2 children, a daughter named Sarah and a son named Andrew. To the people around them, They looked like devoted parents who had given their children every advantage. Andrew Walmsley had grown up inside that comfort, but by his late teens, the relationship with his parents had started to strain. He had dropped out of college, and his mother and father responded by pulling back the financial support he had come to rely on. Somewhere inside that resentment, a plan took shape, one built entirely around the family's money. Andrew stood to inherit an estate worth more than $1.5 million, along with a sizable life insurance policy, and he decided he was not going to wait for it to come to him in the ordinary way. By the time he was finished recruiting help, 3 other people had been pulled into the scheme. His girlfriend, Chelsea Richardson, played a central role, and 2 others were drawn in as well: a friend named Susana Toledano and a restaurant manager named Hilario Cardenas, who supplied the weapon. On the night of December 11th, 2003, Rick and Susanna Walmsley were attacked inside their Mansfield home and harmed fatally in an assault that had been staged to look like a robbery gone wrong. The plan had reportedly included Andrew's older sister, Sarah, as another target, but she was not home that night. Late that evening, a strange, silent call reached emergency services, and it set in motion the discovery of what had taken place. For months, the case seemed to stall. Investigators had a staged crime scene and very little to go on. But members of the Walmsley family had grown suspicious of Andrew early, aware of his recent greed and his temper, and their unease only deepened when Sarah went to court to try to block him from inheriting anything, telling those around her that she feared for her own life. The break, when it finally came from the physical evidence. Strands of hair recovered from Rick Walmsley's hand were matched to Susana Toledano, who was taken into custody and confessed, agreeing to testify against the others in exchange for a life sentence. What she described was chilling in its patience, since the night of the attack had not been the first time the group had tried to carry the plan out. How does a young man raised with every comfort come to see his own parents as an obstacle worth removing? Andrew Walmsley was arrested in the spring of 2004 and charged with capital murder. At trial, he did not so much deny that his family's wealth sat at the center of the case as offer a different explanation for what he had done, claiming he had been driven by years of mistreatment rather than by money. The jury did not accept it and convicted him in March of 2006. Prosecutors had pushed hard for a death sentence, pointing to evidence that Andrew had even tried, from inside jail, to arrange harm to the witnesses who could sink him. In the end, the jury declined to find that he posed a future danger to society, and he was sentenced instead to life in prison. His conviction was affirmed on appeal 2 years later, and it has stood ever since. The others met a range of outcomes. Toledano, who had carried out the actual attack, received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Cardenas, who had provided the gun, was given 50 years. Chelsea Richardson, initially sent to death row as the supposed mastermind of the plot, had her death sentence overturned after a court found that a prosecutor had withheld evidence from her defense, and she was later resentenced to life. As of 2026, Andrew Walmsley remains behind bars at a maximum security prison in southern Texas, and he will not be eligible to be considered for parole until the year 2044. The inheritance he arranged to have his parents die for never reached him. His conviction stripped him of any legal claim to their estate, and the money was divided among other relatives, including the sister he had reportedly wanted out of the way. Walmsley had to assemble a crew of other people to carry out what he wanted done. The wealthy young man whose story comes next needed no such help, and the fortune standing behind him was far larger than anything in a quiet Texas suburb. Delon Millard. He was the heir to a Canadian aviation company, a young man with a private hangar, luxury homes, and enough money that he never really had to explain himself to anyone. For a while, that was exactly the problem. Behind the easy charm was a person who had learned that he could earn the trust of almost anyone, and who used that gift to take the lives of 3 separate people before investigators understood they were dealing with the same man. Dellen Millard was born into the family behind Millardair, an aviation business with deep roots in southern Ontario. He owned a hangar at an airport near Waterloo, 2 homes, a condominium in Toronto, and a farm outside Cambridge. And he moved through his 20s with the freedom of someone who never had to worry about a paycheck. To the people who knew him, he was affable and generous, the kind of well-off young man who drew others easily into his orbit. What none of them could see was how deliberately he was willing to use that trust. The first person to disappear was Laura Babcock, a 23-year-old woman from Toronto who had once been romantically involved with Millard. She vanished in the summer of 2012. According to prosecutors, she had become an inconvenience in a tangle between Millard and his then-girlfriend, and Millard resolved the tension by taking her life and disposing of her body in an animal incinerator he had purchased and grimly nicknamed. Her remains were never recovered. Only months later, in the autumn of that same year, Millard's own father, Wayne, was found dead in his bed of a gunshot wound. At the time, it was ruled a suicide, and the family's grief was allowed to settle around that explanation. It might have ended there, with 2 deaths that no one connected, if not for what Millard did the following spring. In May of 2013, a Hamilton man named Tim Bosma, a 32-year-old husband and father, advertised his pickup truck for sale. 2 men arrived to take it for a test drive, and Bosma climbed into his own truck alongside them and was never seen alive again. His body, investigators would later establish, was destroyed in the same incinerator. The difference this time was that Bosma had told his family exactly what he was doing and who he was meeting. When Hamilton police arrested Millard for Bosma's death, investigators in Toronto took a second look at the 2 earlier cases that had passed quietly through their jurisdiction. The suspicious ties they had once overlooked, the disappearance of Laura Babcock and the convenient suicide of Wayne Millard, suddenly pointed in a single direction. His father's death, once filed away as a self-inflicted tragedy, was reopened and reclassified. Before long, Millard stood charged, along with an associate named Mark Smech, in the deaths of both Bosma and Babcock, and separately and alone in the death of the man who had raised him. What had looked like 3 unrelated misfortunes was now understood as the work of one methodical person who had counted on no one connecting them. What kind of person could sit across from grieving friends and relatives, offer comfort, and know all the while that he was the reason for their grief? The legal reckoning came in 3 parts, and it was staggering in its weight. In 2016, Millard and Smich were convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Tim Bosma, each drawing an automatic life sentence with no chance of parole for 25 years. The following year, the 2 were convicted again, this time for the death of Laura Babcock, and a judge ordered that second life term be served consecutively, pushing Millard's parole ineligibility to 50 years. Then, in 2018, Millard, who by then was representing himself, was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of his father, and a 3rd consecutive term was added on top. The total came to 75 years before he could even apply for release, the longest such period ever handed down in Ontario, a sentence designed to keep him confined until he was past 100 years old. His accomplice, Mark Smich, who had stood beside him through the deaths of Tim Bosma and Laura Babcock, was convicted of first-degree murder in both of those cases and handed life sentences of his own. That extraordinary sentence did not entirely survive the appeals. In 2022, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that stacking parole ineligibility periods in that fashion was unconstitutional, and the following year an appeals court applied that decision to Millard, reducing his wait for parole eligibility from 75 years back down to 25. The same court, however, dismissed every one of his challenges to the convictions themselves. All 3 findings of first-degree murder were upheld. As of 2026, Dellen Millard remains in a Canadian prison, convicted of taking 3 lives, one of them his own father's. Because of that change in the law, his once unprecedented wait for a parole hearing has been shortened, but the convictions that put him there are final, and any prospect of freedom still lies decades away. Millard used charm and money to move among his victims unnoticed. The young man who comes after him built his plan on something colder, a careful accounting of exactly how much he stood to gain the moment his family was gone. Dana Ewell. On Easter Sunday of 1992, a prosperous family returned home to Fresno from a weekend away and walked into an ambush. When the bodies of the father, the mother, and the grown daughter were found, the surviving son played the part of the devastated heir, cooperating with detectives and grieving in public. It would take 3 years of painstaking work to prove that the polite young business student had been the one who ordered it all. The Ewell family was a fixture of Fresno's affluent world. Dale Ewell had built a successful aircraft sales business and turned it into a substantial fortune, and he and his wife, Glee, had raised 2 children in comfort. Their daughter, Tiffany, was a bright young woman of 24. Their son, Dana, was a business student who carried himself with the confidence of someone who expected the world to arrange itself around him. Beneath that confidence, Dana Ewell was a young man in a hurry. He was privately in debt and impatient for the security his family's money represented. And as his college years drew toward a close, he fixed on the idea of inheriting the estate rather than waiting and earning his own way. The fortune he stood to gain was valued at roughly $8 million. To reach it, he turned to a friend from college named Joel Radovchich, and together they built a plan to erase Dana's entire immediate family in a single evening. On the 19th of April, 1992, Dale, Glee, and Tiffany Ewell came home to their house in the Sunnyside area of Fresno and were harmed fatally, each of them shot. Radovchich was the one who carried out the attack, and he took elaborate care to leave nothing of himself behind, reportedly wearing layers of gloves and sitting on plastic sheeting as he waited so that no trace of him would be found. The scene was then disturbed and rearranged to suggest a burglary, an attempt to steer investigators toward the theory of a robbery that had escalated into something worse. For a time, that misdirection worked, and Dana Ewell stood among the mourners as the grieving lone survivor, the dutiful son who had lost everyone. The investigation that followed was one of the most complex in the county's history. Detectives were not fooled for long by the staged burglary, and their suspicion settled on Dana almost from the start, in part because his own mother had caught a glimpse of the killer before she was harmed, a young man who had been a guest in the family home only a month earlier. Proving the connection, though, required years of patient work. Investigators traced a tangle of money moving quietly from Dana to Radovchich, following it through dozens of separate bank accounts, and they gradually built a timeline of contact between 2 men who publicly claimed to barely know each other. A witness eventually came forward to describe what Radovchich had admitted about the killings, providing the human account to go with the financial trail. Through all of it, Dana played the part of the composed, cooperative heir, sitting for interviews with detectives and moving to take control of what was left of the family's affairs, even as the investigators working the case never once let go of their suspicion of him. On the 2nd of March, 1995, nearly 3 years after the family died, both men were arrested. How do you look at a fortune your parents built and decide that the fastest way to it runs directly through them? The trial that followed was long and heavily contested, running for months and drawing more than 100 witnesses. Prosecutors laid out the financial trail, the timeline, and the testimony that tied Dana Ewell to the man who had done the actual harm, and they argued that the entire massacre had been engineered by a son who simply wanted the inheritance sooner. In 1998, both Dana Ewell and Joel Radovich were convicted of the murders. Each was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and for Dana that meant 3 consecutive life terms. One for his father, one for his mother, and one for his sister. There would be no release date to look forward to, and in the years since, no appeal has disturbed the verdicts that a Fresno jury reached at the end of one of the longest cases the county had ever tried. There was one final irony waiting for Dana Ewell. The same conviction that put him away for the rest of his life also barred him, as a matter of law, from ever collecting the inheritance he had schemed to seize, and the fortune he had been so unwilling to wait for passed instead to other members of the family. As of 2026, Dana Ewell is held at a California state prison, kept in protective custody, still serving out those 3 life sentences more than 3 decades after the Easter Sunday that emptied his family home. Joel Radovich, the college friend who carried out the killings for him, is likewise serving life without the possibility of parole. The 2 men bound together by a single evening for the rest of their days. Ewell has spoken over the years of finding religion behind bars, though the investigators who spent years chasing him have remained openly skeptical of the man they came to know. Ewell reached for a fortune his father had spent a lifetime building. This next story belonged to someone who had inherited a famous name and a great deal of money outright, and who used that freedom to prey on the people around him. Andrew Luster. He carried one of the most recognizable names in the history of American cosmetics and a personal fortune to match. A young multi-millionaire living an easy life along the California coast. To the outside world, he looked like a privileged heir with nothing but time on his hands. In private, he was carrying out a series of crimes so calculated that, when the truth came out, his flight from justice would turn into a national spectacle. Andrew Luster was the great-grandson of Max Factor, the man who had built one of the best-known cosmetics empires in the world, and he had come into a substantial share of that fortune. He lived near the beach in Ventura County, comfortable and unbothered, with no need to work. He was, by every outward measure, a man who had been handed an enviable life. But the ease of that life concealed how he was actually spending his time. Over a stretch of years, in the late 1990s and into the year 2000, Luster drugged 3 separate women with a powerful sedative, a substance often described as a date rape drug, and sexually assaulted them while they were unconscious. He recorded what he did, keeping the evidence of his own crimes. The victims, who had no memory of the assaults, were adult women who had crossed paths with a wealthy, seemingly respectable man along the coast. It was the discovery of those recordings that ultimately turned private crimes into a criminal case. In the year 2000, Luster was arrested and charged, and by the time the case went to trial, the count against him had grown into a long list of felonies, 86 in total, spanning the assaults on all 3 women. What happened next is the part of the story most people remember. Partway through his trial in early 2003, out on a bond of $1 million, Andrew Luster simply vanished during a recess in the proceedings. He fled the country rather than face a verdict, surfacing later in a Mexican resort town where he surfed and lived off his wealth as though the case behind him no longer existed. The trial continued without him, and in January of 2003 he was convicted in absentia on every one of those counts. A man found guilty of serious felonies while lounging on a beach hundreds of miles away. Can a man buy his way out of the reckoning that everyone else has to face? For Luster, the answer arrived in an unlikely form. While he was on the run, a celebrity bounty hunter named Dwayne Chapman, better known to television audiences as Dog the Bounty Hunter, tracked him to the resort town of Puerto Vallarta and seized him in the summer of 2003. By then, his months on the run had made him one of the most closely watched fugitives in the country. The capture became a media sensation in its own right, so much so that Chapman and his team would themselves be accused by Mexican authorities of an illegal detention for the way they had grabbed him. Returned to California, Luster faced the consequences of the verdicts handed down in his absence. He was sentenced to a term of 124 years in prison, an extraordinary figure that reflected both the sheer number of counts against him and the calculated nature of what he had done. A name that had meant glamour and cosmetics for generations was now tied to one of the more notorious criminal cases of its era. The legal story did not quite end there. A decade into his sentence, a judge revisited the way it had been imposed, finding that the original trial court had failed to properly explain its reasons for stacking the counts one on top of another, as the law required. The conviction itself was left untouched, and Luster's bid for a new trial was firmly refused, with the judge concluding that he had received sound legal advice and had simply not liked what he heard. But in 2013, the 124-year term was formally set aside and replaced with a sentence of 50 years, a change that left him eligible to seek parole roughly 15 years down the line. It was a reduction, but not a reprieve. He would be an old man before any possibility of release, and the reduced term still counted the years in decades. As of 2026, Andrew Luster remains incarcerated in a California state prison, serving out that 50-year term. The fortune and the famous name that once seemed to place him above ordinary rules did nothing to keep him out of a cell, and the recordings he made of his own crimes became the very evidence that put him there. The women he had harmed, who came forward and then had to endure the strange spectacle of a trial with no defendant in the room, were at least left with the certainty that his money had not bought him a way out. For a time, the case stood as a widely cited example of how far a defendant's fortune could stall the legal process, keeping a reckoning at bay for years on end. Luster inherited a name that had been built by someone else generations back. The next young man in this collection had parents who were still very much alive, still supporting him, and still, he believed, standing in the way of the life he wanted to project. Chandler Halderson. He told people he had a promising job at a famous aerospace company, that he was enrolled at a local college, that he was training with a police dive team. None of it was true. When his father finally began to pull at the threads of those lies, a young man from a comfortable Wisconsin family made a decision that would end with both of his parents gone and their son at the center of one of the most disturbing cases the state had seen in years. Bart and Krista Halderson were a settled, unremarkable couple from Windsor, Wisconsin, a village not far from Madison. Bart was in his early 50s, Krista slightly older, and together they had given their son, Chandler, the steady, comfortable upbringing that a prosecutor would later describe as a life of privilege. They believed their son was building a future, working and studying and finding his footing. In truth, almost none of the life he described to them existed at all. Chandler Halderson had constructed an elaborate false version of himself. He claimed to work for a well-known private space company, to be taking classes at a technical college, and to belong to a law enforcement diving team, and he maintained the fiction even with those closest to him, including a girlfriend who believed he was steadily employed. The truth was that there was no job, no enrollment, no dive team. As long as no one checked too closely, the invented life held together. The danger for Chandler was the moment someone did. That moment came in the summer of 2021, when his father began to look more carefully into the claims about the technical college and discovered they were false. On or around the 1st of July, inside the family home in Windsor, Chandler took his father's life with a high-powered rifle on a day the two of them were supposed to attend a meeting together, and when his mother returned home, he took hers as well. What he did afterward is difficult to describe without stepping past the limits of decency, and so it is enough to say that he went to extraordinary and gruesome lengths to conceal what he had done, dismembering his parents and scattering their remains across more than one county in an effort to make them disappear. Some of what was recovered was found on the rural property of a family acquaintance, days after the couple was first reported missing. Then he tried to talk his way out of it. Chandler reported his parents missing, telling investigators that they had driven to a family cabin in the northern part of the state for the 4th of July weekend and had never come back. It was, in a sense, the same instinct that had built the fake job and the fake school, the belief that a confident story could paper over any reality. But this time the story collided with hard evidence, and cell phone data quickly showed that his parents had never left home at all. What does it take to look investigators in the eye and report your own parents missing, knowing exactly where their remains are? The case against him was methodical and overwhelming. Over an 8-day trial, prosecutors walked jurors through the collapse of Chandler's invented life, the physical evidence recovered from the home and from the sites where the remains were found, and the timeline that his own false statements had exposed. One of the prosecutors pointed to the comfortable, privileged upbringing he had been given as the very thing that made the crime so hard to fathom. In January of 2022, after only a few hours of deliberation, the jury convicted him on every count against him, a stack of charges that included 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, along with counts of mutilating a corpse, hiding a corpse, and giving false information about a missing person. That March, the judge sentenced him to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole, telling the court that his duty to protect the public required the harshest sentence the law allowed, and noting pointedly that the only time Chandler Halderson would return to the community would be for the kind of burial he had denied his own parents. His conviction has held up under review. A portion of the lesser counts was later set aside by the court, but the 2 homicide convictions and the life sentences remained fully intact. Halderson pressed on with an appeal, arguing that his trial had been unfair and that his lawyers had failed him. And in late 2025, a state appeals court rejected those arguments outright, finding nothing to support them. The state's highest court declined to disturb the result. As of 2026, Chandler Halderson is serving those 2 life sentences at a Wisconsin correctional institution, with no prospect of release. For Chandler Halderson, a lie about a job and a college he never attended had grown, step by step, into the deaths of both his parents, and it will keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. Cameron Douglas. When agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration walked into a room at a Manhattan hotel in July of 2009, the man they had come for was the grandson of a Hollywood legend and the son of an Oscar winner. What they found with him was roughly $18,000 worth of crystal methamphetamine. His father would spend the next several years telling anyone who would listen that the courts had been too hard on his son. The judge handling the case eventually decided the opposite was true. Cameron Morell Douglas was born on December 13, 1978, the only child of the actor Michael Douglas and his first wife, Diandra Luker, and the grandson of Kirk Douglas. He had a small acting career of his own, including a 2003 film in which 3 generations of the family appeared on screen together. By his own account, the drugs came early. He has said he was smoking marijuana at 13, using cocaine at 15, trying crystal methamphetamine at 17, and that by adulthood he was addicted to liquid cocaine and to heroin. The family knew. Michael Douglas intervened again and again over the years, at one point hiring men to physically remove his son and deliver him to a rehab facility. None of it changed what Cameron was doing by his late 20s, which was moving methamphetamine and cocaine between California and New York for the people who supplied him in bulk. The arrest came on July 28, 2009, at the Hotel Gansevoort. Because of the quantity of methamphetamine he was carrying, prosecutors did not charge him with simple possession. They charged him with possession with intent to distribute, and that decision changed his exposure entirely. He had heroin on him as well. Then came the part that shaped everything after it. Douglas was released to house arrest while he waited to be sentenced, and he did not stop using. His girlfriend brought heroin to him inside a hollowed-out electric toothbrush, in a house the government was already watching. So how much room does a famous surname actually buy inside a federal courtroom? On January 27, 2010, Douglas pleaded guilty to conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine and to possession of heroin. He was facing a mandatory minimum of 10 years, which is a floor a judge cannot go under, no matter who the defendant's father is. What brought him under it was cooperation. He handed authorities the names of his suppliers, the brothers David and Eduardo Escalera, and that cooperation qualified him for a sentence below the mandatory minimum. In April of 2010, Judge Richard Berman sentenced him to 5 years and told him from the bench that this was his last chance to make it. Michael Douglas was by then speaking publicly about how severely his son was being treated and about the sentencing system that produced it. Then, in 2011, Douglas admitted that he had been having drugs smuggled to him inside the prison. Berman brought him back into court and added 4.5 years to his sentence. That was more than twice what prosecutors themselves had asked for. The judge described him as reckless, disruptive, and unwilling to comply with anything the court had ordered, so the outcome ran in an unusual direction. A defendant with as much support behind him as anyone in the federal system was handed a break, and then punished more heavily than the government itself had asked for because of what he did with that break. There is also a cost to cooperation that never appears in a sentencing transcript. Naming your suppliers in a federal drug case follows you inside, and Douglas served the rest of his time in a system where that was known about him. He spent roughly 2 years of it in solitary confinement between 2012 and 2014 at a federal facility in Cumberland, Maryland. That stretch became the centerpiece of his father's public argument that the punishment had outrun the crime. By the time it was over, he had served close to 7 years, which is most of a decade taken out of a man's 30s. Douglas was released in August of 2016 to a halfway house in Brooklyn. In October of 2019, he published a memoir about all of it and sat down for a network television interview. In 2020, a Manhattan judge ended his supervised release a full year early, pointing to the change in the direction of his life. As of 2026, Cameron Douglas is reported to have been sober since 2016. He works as an actor and an author, with a net worth reported at around $5 million, and he is the father of 2 children, Lua, born in 2017, and Ryder, born in 2020, with his former partner Vivian Teebs. He appears publicly alongside his father, and he speaks about addiction recovery and criminal justice reform. Michael Douglas spent years and a considerable amount of money trying to pull his son back from the edge, and a federal judge eventually agreed that the effort had worked. 2 decades earlier, another Hollywood father put his entire estate on the line for a son of his own. That story did not end with a recovery. Christian Brando. On an evening in May of 1990, a single shot was fired inside the Mulholland Drive home of one of the most famous actors who ever lived. The man who fired it was Marlon Brando's eldest son. The man who lost his life was the boyfriend of Brando's pregnant daughter. And the story that put a loaded pistol in that room in the first place was later reported to have been invented. Christian Devi Brando was born on May 11, 1958, the eldest of Marlon Brando's 11 acknowledged children, and his only child with his first wife, the actress Anna Kashfi. His childhood was consumed by a custody fight between two famous parents, including a kidnapping episode in 1972. He was sent to boarding school, he began using drugs, and he dropped out of high school. Doug Drolet was 26 years old and from Tahiti. He was the boyfriend of Cheyenne Brando, Christian's half-sister, and she was pregnant with his child. On the night of May 16, 1990, he was sitting in a room at the Brando estate watching television. What happened next has two versions. Christian said that Cheyenne had told him Drolet was beating her, that he confronted Drolet with a .45 caliber pistol, and that the weapon discharged during a struggle. He described it as an accident. Prosecutors said it was nothing of the kind, that he had gone into that room intending to end a life, and that the physical evidence supported them. Doug Drolet was fatally harmed at the scene. Cheyenne told police plainly that this had not been an accident. She then left the country for Tahiti, where she remained beyond the reach of American courts. She was later ruled mentally incompetent, and it was subsequently reported that the abuse claims she had made about Drolet were fabricated. That left the prosecution holding a case with no witness to motive. The woman who had told them it was deliberate was gone. The story she had told her brother about being beaten was reported to be untrue, and there was no longer anybody left who could explain to a jury why Christian Brando had walked into that room armed. The next decision belonged to Marlon Brando. Christian was being held in county jail, and the bail figure was well beyond what most families could produce. His father put up his multi-million-dollar estate as collateral, and Christian walked out after 3 months. Most defendants facing a first-degree murder charge in Los Angeles County in 1990 waited for trial from a jail cell. Christian Brando waited for his at liberty because his father owned enough property to make that possible. What is a first-degree murder case actually worth when the only person who can speak to why it happened has left the country and will never take the stand? Prosecutors had originally charged Christian Brando with first-degree murder, which carried an exposure of 25 years to life. On January 4, 1991, he pleaded guilty instead to voluntary manslaughter with the use of a handgun. It was a substantial reduction, and it came directly out of the collapse of the case against him. Sentencing came on March 1, 1991. Judge Robert Thomas gave him 10 years, made up of 6 years for the manslaughter count and 4 more for the use of the firearm. The hearing itself became one of the more remarkable scenes in Los Angeles court history, because Marlon Brando took the stand on his son's behalf and testified through tears that he had failed him as a father. He did not argue that Christian was innocent. He argued that the man in the dock was the product of choices Marlon himself had made, and he said so under oath, in open court, in front of every camera in the city. Whether that testimony moved the number is impossible to know. What is knowable is the arithmetic. Christian Brando had been facing 25 years to life, and he walked out of that courtroom with 10. He served roughly 5 of them and was released in 1996. The years after did not go well. He developed an addiction to crystal methamphetamine and eventually moved to rural Washington. In 2001, his name surfaced in connection with the death of Bonnie Lee Bakley, the wife of the actor Robert Blake. Blake's defense team tried to point suspicion toward him during that case. It is worth being precise here, because the allegation has followed him ever since. Christian Brando was never charged in that matter, and he was not in Los Angeles when it happened. It was an allegation raised by a defense team, and it was never anything more than that. In 2005, he pleaded no contest to spousal abuse involving his then-wife, Deborah, and was placed on probation. He died of pneumonia on January 26, 2008, at the age of 49. As of 2026, the voluntary manslaughter conviction from 1991 remains the only legal finding ever entered in Dag Drolet's death. Nobody else was ever charged, and the case has never been reopened. Marlon Brando's fortune bought his son a courtroom instead of a cell block while the case was pending. In the Caribbean, 15 years later, a different kind of family advantage was at work, and it had nothing to do with money. Joran van der Sloot. Two young women disappeared in his company exactly 5 years apart, to the day. For 18 years, he denied any part in what happened to the first one, and for most of that time, the police in Aruba could not hold him longer than a few days at a stretch. When the confession finally came, it came inside an American courtroom, as part of a bargain that added not one single day to the time he was already serving. Joran van der Sloot was born on August 6, 1987, in Arnhem, in the Netherlands. His family moved to Aruba when he was 3, and it is his father who matters most to this story. Paulus van der Sloot was a lawyer on the island who was training to become a judge, which put him inside the same small legal community that would be investigating his son. According to authorities, when he was briefly detained himself in 2005, he told Joran that the police had no case without a body. Natalie Holloway was 18 years old, from Mountain Brook, Alabama, and she was in Aruba on a high school graduation trip. On the night of May 30, 2005, she left a nightclub in Orangestad with van der Sloot and 2 brothers, Deepak and Satish Kalpo. She was never seen again. She was declared legally dead in January of 2012. Van der Sloot was arrested on June 9, 2005, and again that November. Each time, prosecutors concluded they did not have enough to hold him, and each time he walked out. He was never charged in Aruba with anything relating to her disappearance. In the years that followed, he gave a series of shifting accounts to journalists and to hidden cameras, none of which produced a case. Then came May 30, 2010. 5 years to the day after Natalie Holloway disappeared, van der Sloot was in a hotel room in Lima, Peru, with a 21-year-old business student named Stephanie Flores. She was the daughter of a wealthy Peruvian businessman named Ricardo Flores, and she had met van der Sloot at a poker table. She was fatally harmed in that room. This time there was no ambiguity about jurisdiction. He fled across the border into Chile and was apprehended there on June 3, 2010, 4 days later. Peru brought him back, and in 2012 he was convicted and sentenced to 28 years. The contrast with Aruba is the whole point of this case. In Peru, he was in custody within a week and sentenced inside 2 years. In Aruba, where his father worked in the courts and knew everyone in them, he had been arrested twice and released twice, and no charge was ever filed. So how does a man who was never charged with anything in Aruba end up standing in a federal courtroom in Alabama? The answer is what he did in the weeks before he ever went to Peru. In 2010, a United States federal grand jury indicted him for attempting to extort $250,000 from Natalie Holloway's mother, Beth Holloway, in exchange for telling her where her daughter's remains were. He took an initial payment, $10,000 in cash at a meeting in Aruba, and $15,000 wired to his account in the Netherlands on May 15, 2010. Then he gave her information that was false. That indictment sat for 13 years while he served time in Peru. In June of 2023, Peru temporarily surrendered him to the United States. He was flown to Birmingham, Alabama, and he initially pleaded not guilty. On October 18, 2023, that changed. He pleaded guilty to extortion and wire fraud, and as part of the agreement, he sat for a proffer session that was verified by polygraph. In it, he admitted that he had taken Natalie Holloway's life on a beach in Aruba after she rejected his advances, and that he had left her in the ocean. The terms of that agreement matter. Judge Ana Manasco sentenced him to 20 years, to run concurrently with the Peruvian sentence he was already serving. which meant the American case added no additional prison time at all. The confession itself cannot be used against him in any other prosecution. He has still never been convicted of a crime in connection with Natalee Holloway's death, and 18 years after she disappeared, the admission cost him nothing. Beth Holloway addressed him directly in that courtroom. She told him what he was, and she told him she wanted him to remember it every time a jail door closed behind him. As of 2026, Joran van der Sloot is back in Peru, serving out the 28-year sentence handed down for Stephanie Flores. No charges have ever been filed in Aruba. Van der Sloot's advantage came from a father who understood exactly how evidence works. The next case runs on a different mechanism entirely, one where the courts kept handing the same young man back to the same family year after year, without anyone stopping to ask what was actually wrong with him. Redmond O'Neill. He was the only child of two of the biggest film stars of the 1970s. Between 2005 and 2015, he was arrested repeatedly, and almost every one of those cases ended in probation, a diversion program, or a bed in a treatment facility rather than a prison term. In 2018, that pattern ended with a string of violent incidents across Los Angeles. 8 years later, the case has still not gone to trial. Redmond James Fawcett O'Neill was born on January 30th, 1985. The only child of the actress Farrah Fawcett and the actor Ryan O'Neill. He had a brief career as a child voice actor. His upbringing was unstable in ways that were widely reported at the time, with substance use on both sides of the family. When Fawcett died in 2009, she left him a trust reported at around $4.5 million, though that figure comes from a single account and has never been confirmed in court records. The arrest history begins in 2005, when he was picked up on suspicion of possessing methamphetamine and cocaine. He was given probation. In 2007, he was arrested again on a drug possession charge, along with a misdemeanor count of driving under the influence, and received 3 years of probation and a fine of $1,688. The most widely covered arrest came in September of 2008. When police searched the Malibu home he shared with his father and found methamphetamine. Both men were arrested. Ryan O'Neill pleaded guilty and entered an 18-month diversion program and told the press publicly that the responsibility was his. Redmond pleaded guilty and entered drug diversion as well. The cases kept coming. In 2009, he faced a felony charge for bringing heroin into a jail facility in Castaic. In 2011, he entered a no-contest plea to felony heroin possession and to being a felon in possession of a firearm. In 2015, he was finally sentenced to 3 years for violating probation, and he was released in 2016. 2 years later, on May 8, 2018, everything escalated. Over a short span, 2 men were harmed with a knife in separate incidents, and a convenience store in Santa Monica was robbed. Police arrested O'Neill that day. Prosecutors charged him with attempted murder, 2 counts of assault with a deadly weapon, criminal threats, brandishing a knife, and battery. It was the first time in his adult life that he was facing charges no diversion program could absorb. At what point does a decade of second chances stop looking like leniency and start looking like a system that never once asked what was actually wrong with him? That question turned out to be the entire case. In 2019, O'Neill was ruled mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to Patton State Hospital. Clinicians there diagnosed him with schizophrenia, with bipolar disorder, and with antisocial personality disorder. His conservator has consistently pointed to the schizophrenia diagnosis as the central one. He remained at Patton for roughly 6 years. Under California law, a defendant found incompetent cannot be tried until competency is restored. And until that happens, the criminal case simply waits. There is no trial, no verdict, and no resolution for anyone involved, including the two men who were harmed in 2018 and who have now spent 8 years waiting for a courtroom to take up what happened to them. The record here does not support a simple story about family money buying a way out of trouble. What it shows is a young man with a serious psychiatric illness moving through a court system that treated him as an addict for more than a decade. The name and the resources kept him out of state prison through most of his 20s. They also kept him out of the kind of custody where somebody might have looked harder at what was actually happening to him. His competency was restored in 2025. In March of 2026, his attorney entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf, at what was his first court appearance in close to a decade. He appeared visibly changed, with tattoos across his face that had not been there when he went in. His conservator, Mela Murphy, who was a close friend of Farrah Fawcett, has said publicly that he has been free of drugs and has been a model patient at Patton State Hospital for 5 years, and that he is active in a 12-step recovery program. As of the middle of 2026, the case has not gone to trial. Redmond O'Neill remains in custody with a plea of not guilty standing, on charges filed 8 years earlier. Nothing about the attempted murder count has yet been tested in front of a jury. Redmond O'Neill inherited a famous name he never asked for, and the doors it opened were mostly the doors out of courtrooms. The woman in the case that follows had no famous name at all. She built one from nothing and used it to convince Rupert Murdoch and the Walton family to hand over their money. Elizabeth Holmes. She dropped out of Stanford, told investors her machine could run hundreds of medical tests on a few drops of blood, and by 2014, her company was valued at roughly $9 billion. Rupert Murdoch put money in. So did the Walton family. The technology never worked, and it had never worked. And by the time a federal jury said so out loud, more than $700 million had already gone into it. Elizabeth Holmes left Stanford in 2003 to build Theranos. What she brought with her was not a working device. It was a well-connected background, an unusual ability to hold a room, and access to the kind of people who could open doors that stay closed to almost everybody else. The pitch was straightforward, and it was enormous. Instead of drawing vials of blood at a clinic, a patient would give a few drops from a finger, and a Theranos machine would run a full panel of tests on them. It would be cheaper, faster, and available anywhere. If it had worked, it would have changed how ordinary medicine is delivered. It did not work. Blood taken from a finger stick is not the same sample as blood drawn from a vein, and in very small volumes the results drift. That was a known problem in laboratory medicine long before Theranos existed, and the company never solved it. The devices were unreliable, and Theranos was quietly running many of its tests on conventional commercial equipment, while telling the world otherwise. What kept it alive was the investor list, and the investor list is the reason this case belongs on any list about privilege. Rupert Murdoch, the Walton family, Betsy DeVos, and the Cox family all put money in. Tim Draper was an early backer. James Mattis sat on the board. That list is what kept the money coming, and the valuation peaked at around $9 billion across 2013 and 2014. How does a company whose central product does not function survive more than a decade of due diligence by some of the most sophisticated investors in the world? The Securities and Exchange Commission filed its civil case in 2018 and described what had happened as a massive fraud carried out over more than a decade. The criminal case took considerably longer. Her trial ran nearly 4 months. On January 3, 2022, a federal jury convicted her on 1 count of conspiracy to defraud investors and 3 counts of wire fraud, tied to transfers totaling more than $140 million. The verdict was not a clean sweep. She was acquitted on the counts relating to patients who had received inaccurate test results, and the jury hung on 3 additional investor counts. That split is worth sitting with, because it defines what she was actually convicted of. The jury was persuaded that she had lied to the people who gave her money. It was not persuaded, at least not beyond reasonable doubt, that she had criminally defrauded the patients who received results from machines that did not function. The investors got a verdict. The patients did not. Sentencing came on November 18, 2022. Judge Edward Davila sentenced her to 135 months, which is 11 and a quarter years, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He found that 10 investor victims had lost $385 million. Holmes and her co-defendant, Ramesh Balwani, who had been the company's president, were ordered to pay $452 million in restitution between them. She reported to federal prison Camp Bryan in Texas on May 30, 2023. It is a minimum security women's camp, which is where the federal system houses nonviolent offenders serving longer terms. She appealed everything. The conviction, the sentence, and the restitution order all went up to the Ninth Circuit, and in February of 2025, the court upheld all 3. The restitution piece matters most because that debt outlives the prison term. Whatever happens to the sentence from here, the $452 million order stands. That ruling closed the ordinary route out. What was left was the one avenue that runs entirely outside the courts. In December of 2025, it was reported that she was seeking clemency from President Trump, and a formal request followed in January of 2026. A commutation would not erase the conviction. It would shorten or end the sentence, and it would do so without any judge being asked to agree. As of this recording, nothing has been granted, and the request remains unresolved. As of 2026, Elizabeth Holmes is still at federal prison Camp Bryan. With good conduct credits, her projected release date is August 16, 2032. The next name on this list raised money the same way Holmes did, on pedigree and confidence rather than on anything anybody had independently verified. The difference is that when his company came apart, the hole in it was not $700 million. It was $8 billion. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Sam Bankman-Fried. He was born on the campus of Stanford University to 2 professors at its law school, and by the age of 30, he was running one of the largest crypto exchanges in the world and writing enormous checks to politicians in both parties. When his company collapsed in November of 2022, federal prosecutors said $8 billion of customer money had gone missing. What almost nobody expected is what happened to that money afterward. Sam Bankman-Fried was born on March 5, 1992. His parents, Joseph Bankman and Barbara Fried, both taught at Stanford Law School, and he grew up inside a household that took moral philosophy seriously as a subject of dinner conversation. He came out of that background, committed to a version of utilitarian thinking that later attached itself to the effective altruism movement, and the argument he made for himself in public was simple. Make as much money as possible, then give it away to the causes that save the most lives. That pedigree is the privilege in this case. He did not inherit a fortune. He inherited access. The academic name, the connections, and the fluency to talk to people in Silicon Valley and in Washington on their own terms open doors that stay shut for almost every other founder in that industry. FTX launched in 2019 and grew at a speed that should have invited more questions than it did. Bankman-Fried became one of the largest political donors in the United States, appeared at conferences alongside former heads of state, and was written about as the responsible adult of an unserious industry. Then, in November of 2022, the whole thing came apart in a matter of days. Customers tried to withdraw their money, and discovered it was not there. Manhattan federal prosecutors described what they found as a fraud of enormous proportions. Their case was that Bankman-Fried had taken $8 billion belonging to FTX customers and spent it on investments, on real estate, on political donations, and on covering the losses of Alameda Research, the trading firm he also controlled. Where does $8 billion of other people's money go without a single internal control stopping it? The answer, as it emerged at trial, was that there were essentially no controls to stop it. The trial ran in November of 2023, and the jury convicted him on all 7 counts he faced. 2 of those were substantive wire fraud counts. The others were conspiracy counts, covering conspiracy to commit wire fraud, securities fraud, commodities fraud, and money laundering. Sentencing came on March 28, 2024. Judge Lewis Kaplan sentenced him to 25 years and entered a forfeiture order of $11 billion. The court's findings on loss were specific. FTX customers were out $8 billion. Equity investors in the company were out $1.7 billion, and lenders to Alameda were out $1.3 billion. The consequences reached his family as well. The FTX estate later sued his parents over money and property they had received while the company was operating, including a cash gift of $10 million and a house in the Bahamas worth $16.4 million. He appealed, and the appeal took more than 2 years. On June 12, 2026, the Second Circuit upheld both the conviction and the sentence. The opinion was written by Senior Judge Barrington Parker, who described the evidence at trial as overwhelming even on a conservative reading of it, and wrote that Bankman-Fried had knowingly and intentionally committed large-scale fraud while treating FTX as his own personal bank account. Here is where this case separates itself from every other financial collapse on this list. The customers got paid back. The FTX Recovery Trust, run by the restructuring specialist John Ray III, began distributions in February of 2025. By the 5th distribution, on July 31st of 2026, roughly $900 million more went out the door, bringing the cumulative total to approximately $10.9 billion. Creditors have now received more than the full November 2022 value of their claims. Recovery rates run from 105% for the main pools of American and international customers, up to 120% for the smallest claims, plus interest on top. People who follow bankruptcy work in that sector describe the result as close to unprecedented. Bankman-Fried's position is that this vindicates him. Prosecutors and the court have consistently said the opposite, which is that the recovery was produced by a rising market and by years of work from the estate, not by anything he did, and that the crime was complete the moment the money was taken. As of 2026, Sam Bankman-Fried is held at a low-security federal facility in California. He maintains his innocence and is seeking a pardon from President Trump. Nothing has been granted. He becomes eligible for release around 2044. Bankman-Fried's advantage was a pedigree that made powerful people assume he must know what he was doing. The man who comes after him had no pedigree at all. What he had was a body that could do things almost nobody else's could, and a professional football contract that turned that body into $40 million. Aaron Hernandez. In 2012, he signed a contract extension with the New England Patriots worth up to $40 million. Less than a year later, he was in a jail cell, and the team had cut him the same day he was arrested. He would eventually be tried for 3 deaths, convicted in one case and acquitted in the other, and 5 days after that acquittal, he was gone. What a laboratory in Boston found afterward changed how the sport talks about its own players. Aaron Hernandez was an All-American tight end at the University of Florida and a 4th-round pick of the Patriots in 2010. He was very good very quickly, and the extension he signed in 2012 made him one of the highest-paid players at his position in the league. The privilege in this case is not inherited money. It is what elite athletic status does to a young man's sense of what the rules apply to. Odin Lloyd was 27 years old and played semi-professional football in the Boston area. He was dating Shania Jenkins, the sister of Hernandez's fiancée, Shayana Jenkins, which is how the two men knew each other. In June of 2013, he was found in an industrial park, a short distance from Hernandez's home in North Attleboro, Massachusetts. He had been fatally harmed. The motive prosecutors offered was almost unbearably small. Days earlier, at a Boston nightclub, Lloyd had spent part of the evening talking with people Hernandez did not like. That was it. That was the reason the state put in front of a jury. Hernandez was arrested on June 26, 2013. The Patriots released him within hours, before any charge had been tested and before any evidence had been heard, which is not how professional football teams usually treat players they have just paid. What does a jury do with a defendant whose entire adult life has been organized around the assumption that consequences are somebody else's problem? In this instance, it convicted him. On April 15, 2015, a Bristol County jury found Hernandez guilty of first-degree murder, along with weapons charges. Under Massachusetts law, that conviction carried no discretion at all. The sentence was life without the possibility of parole, and he was sent to the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center. Sousa Baranowski is the highest security prison in the Massachusetts system, and he spent the remaining 2 years of his life inside it. He was 25 years old when the door closed behind him. That was not the end of his exposure. Prosecutors in Boston had also charged him in connection with a drive-by shooting in 2012, in which 2 men, Daniel de Abreu and Safiro Furtado, lost their lives. That trial ran in the spring of 2017, and on April 14th, he was acquitted of both counts. The only thing the jury convicted him of was a weapons charge. 5 days later, on April 19, 2017, Aaron Hernandez was found unresponsive in his cell at around 3 in the morning. His death was ruled a suicide. He was 27 years old, the same age Odin Lloyd had been. His death then produced one of the strangest legal sequences in Massachusetts history. Because he died while his appeal was still pending, an old common law doctrine called abatement ab initio applied, and it wipes out a conviction that never had the chance to be reviewed. The Lloyd conviction was vacated. That decision was later reversed on appeal, and the conviction was reinstated. It stands today. In November of 2017, Boston University announced the result of the examination of his brain. Dr. Anne McKee, who runs the university's Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy Center, reported stage 3 of 4 and said it was the most severe case she had seen in anyone of his age. The next youngest comparable case in the study was 46 years old. Hernandez was 27. That finding became the basis of a civil case. His daughter Avielle, through Shayana Jenkins, sued the National Football League and the Patriots for $20 million, arguing that they had concealed what the sport does to the human brain. United States District Judge Anita Brody dismissed it. Her ruling was that Hernandez was bound by the terms of the league's concussion class action settlement because he was deemed effectively retired and had never opted out of it. The finding also landed on a sport that had spent years disputing the link between repeated head impacts and later brain disease. Hernandez had started playing tackle football as a young boy and had been hit for a living ever since. Nothing in the finding excuses what a jury found he did, and Dr. McKee has been careful never to claim it does. What it established is that the brain examined in that laboratory was not a normal 27-year-old brain. As of 2026, the first-degree murder conviction in Odin Lloyd's death stands as the final legal word on that case. The double homicide acquittal also stands. The civil suit is over, and the brain study remains one of the most cited findings in the field. Hernandez lost everything over an exchange at a nightclub, and whatever else that was, nobody argued it had been planned. 11 years before he was drafted, another professional football player did something to the mother of his child that a jury found had been arranged well in advance. Ray Caruth. He was a first-round draft pick who had already made it, and the state's theory was that he arranged an ambush on a public road in Charlotte to avoid paying child support. What he did not account for was that the woman in the car would stay conscious long enough to call for help and say his name. Her son survived. 26 years later, that son is the reason most people still remember the case at all. Ray Caruth starred at the University of Colorado and was taken by the Carolina Panthers in the first round of the 1997 draft. He was not a wealthy man by professional athlete standards. His net worth at the time was reported at around $368,000. What he did have was status, and the prosecution's case was that he believed status made him untouchable. Cherika Adams was 24 years old and lived in Charlotte. She and Caruth had been in an on-and-off relationship, and by the autumn of 1999, she was pregnant with his child. On the night of November 16, 1999, she was driving her own car through Charlotte with Caruth, driving ahead of her in his. According to prosecutors, Caruth slowed and stopped his car in front of hers, which forced her to stop as well. A second vehicle then pulled alongside, and shots were fired into her car. She was struck 4 times. What happened next is the reason this case ever reached a courtroom. Cherika Adams called emergency services herself and stayed on the line for roughly 12 minutes. On that call, she described what had happened, and she said that the man in the car in front of her was the father of her child. She survived the immediate aftermath. She passed away weeks later. Her son, Chancellor Lee Adams, was delivered by emergency cesarean section that night and lived. He sustained a brain injury caused by oxygen deprivation, and he has cerebral palsy as a result. He requires care for the rest of his life. Cherika's mother, Sandra Adams, took him in and has raised him ever since. Is there any version of privilege more absolute than the belief that you can arrange something like this and expect it not to attach to you? The jury did not fully agree with the state on that point, and the verdict it returned in January of 2001 was a split one. Caruth was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, of shooting into an occupied vehicle, and of using an instrument to destroy an unborn child. He was acquitted of first-degree murder, which meant the death penalty came off the table and the mandatory life sentence went with it. He was sentenced to a term of 18 to 24 years. The verdict turned in large part on that emergency call. A statement made by someone who believes they are dying carries a weight in court that ordinary hearsay does not. And Cherika Adams had described the sequence of events in her own words while it was happening. Without that call, the state's theory about who stopped which car in front of whom would have been almost impossible to prove. He served nearly 19 of them. Ray Caruth was released on October 22, 2018, from Sampson Correctional Institution in North Carolina, and served roughly 9 more months of supervised release in Pennsylvania. The count involving the unborn child is the one most people misremember. North Carolina charged him with using an instrument to destroy an unborn child, and the jury convicted on it. That count, along with the conspiracy conviction, is what produced a sentence long enough to keep him inside for nearly 2 decades after the first-degree murder acquittal took the heaviest option away. Before his release, he wrote a 15-page letter of apology and gave an interview to a Charlotte television station in which he said he wanted to be part of his son's life and hoped for custody. Sandra Adams, who had by then spent nearly 2 decades raising Chancellor, rejected that outright. She has said publicly that she forgave Carruth years ago, and that forgiveness and custody are entirely different questions. She has also spent a quarter of a century doing the thing this case actually turned on, which is caring for a young man who needs help with almost everything, every day, without the resources a professional athlete's salary would have provided. In December of 2019, according to Sandra Adams, Carruth mailed a check for several $1,000s to Chancellor through the court system. She described it as significant and generous. It did not change the arrangement. As of 2026, Chancellor Lee Adams is still being raised and cared for by his grandmother, and any relationship between him and his father remains limited. Carruth has stayed almost entirely out of public view since his supervised release ended. Both of the athletes here were convicted by juries that heard everything the state had to offer. What follows reverses that completely. The man in it was investigated, cleared, and honorably discharged, and it took 9 years and a relative who would not let it go before he ever saw the inside of a criminal courtroom. Jeffrey MacDonald. He was an Army doctor and a Green Beret captain, and in 1970, the military investigated the deaths of his family, recommended that the charges against him be dropped, and gave him an honorable discharge. 9 years later, a federal jury convicted him of all 3. He is now 82 years old. He has been eligible for parole since 1991, and he refuses to apply for it. Jeffrey MacDonald was born on October 12, 1943. By his mid-20s, he was a physician and an officer in the Army Special Forces stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. That is the privilege in this case, and it has nothing to do with money. He was not rich, and he was not the child of anyone famous. What he had was the credibility that comes with being a clean-cut young doctor in uniform, and in 1970, that credibility was worth more than a fortune would have been. At roughly 3:42 in the morning on February 17, 1970, MacDonald called for help from his quarters on Castle Drive. Inside the house, his wife Colette, who was pregnant, and both of their young daughters had been fatally harmed. MacDonald himself was found with wounds that were comparatively minor. The account he gave was that 4 intruders had come into the house, 3 men and a woman with blonde hair in a floppy hat who was holding a candle and chanting slogans associated with the Manson case. A word had been written on a headboard in the house that echoed the killings in Los Angeles 6 months earlier. The Army's Article 32, hearing that year, examined all of it and recommended that the charges against him be dismissed. He was released, and he received an honorable discharge. That should have been the end of it, and it very nearly was. What kept the case alive was a single person. Alfred Kassab was Colette's stepfather, and in the beginning he was MacDonald's most vocal defender. Over the following years, he changed his mind completely, went through the investigative file himself, and began pressing the Justice Department to prosecute. What does it take to reopen a case that a military tribunal has already closed in the accused man's favor? In this instance, it took 5 more years. A federal grand jury indicted MacDonald in 1975. The prosecution's theory was that he had caused the deaths himself and then staged the scene to look like an intruder attack. Because the events happened on a military installation, the case was tried in federal civilian court. On August 29, 1979, the jury convicted him of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms. The legal fight has never really stopped since. His convictions were briefly overturned on speedy trial grounds in 1980, and he was out on bail for about 15 months before the United States Supreme Court reinstated them in 1982. Later, habeas petitions were built on newer DNA testing, and on a claim from a retired deputy United States Marshal named Jimmy Britt regarding a witness, Helena Stoeckley, who had at various points said she was in the house. A full evidentiary hearing before Judge James Fox in 2012 ended with the district court denying relief. In December of 2018, the Fourth Circuit refused to order a new trial, and in 2019, the Supreme Court declined to take the case. There is also a chapter of this story that ended up in law schools. In 1979, MacDonald hired the journalist Joe McGinnis to write a book that would establish his innocence, and gave him extraordinary access. McGinnis became convinced of his guilt and published Fatal Vision in 1983, which portrayed him as responsible and became a television miniseries. The relationship between the two men became a case study in what a journalist owes a subject, and the writer Janet Malcolm built an entire book around it. MacDonald sued for $15 million. The trial ended with a deadlocked jury in August of 1987 and settled that November for $325,000, of which he reportedly kept around $50,000 after a follow-on suit by the Kassabs and his own legal fees. In November of 2020, he filed for compassionate release, citing chronic kidney disease, skin cancer, and hypertension. Judge Terrence Boyle denied it on April 9, 2021, ruling that the statute does not reach defendants sentenced under the old federal rules that applied before 1987. His appeal of that ruling was dismissed on September 16, 2021. As of the most recent available records, Jeffrey MacDonald is alive and incarcerated at a federal facility in Cumberland, Maryland, at the age of 82. He has been parole eligible since 1991 and has never applied, because applying would require him to admit guilt. He has maintained his innocence for 56 years, and a vocal group of supporters continues to argue that the 1979 verdict was wrong. MacDonald's shield was respectability, and it delayed a prosecution by nearly a decade. The final case on this list involves a family with far more money than his ever had, and a shield that failed in a much darker way. Camden Burton Nicholson. The house sat behind a gate in one of the wealthiest coastal communities in California, and for several days in February of 2019, it held a scene that nobody outside knew about. The young man living inside had come home from a mission abroad 2 years earlier and had never been the same since. His parents had just given him an ultimatum about treatment. 6 years later, a jury would have to decide whether he understood what he had done. Camden Burton Nicholson grew up in a gated neighborhood in Newport Beach, California, the kind of address that functions as a wall between a family and everybody else's problems. He returned from a 9-month mission abroad and, by every account given later in court, came back changed. Prosecutors described him as completely dependent on his parents. By late 2018, he was using drugs and steroids and behaving erratically enough that his parents hired a private investigator to locate him when he went missing. He had been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. Richard Nicholson was 64. Kim Nicholson was 61. They had reached the point that families in this situation eventually reach. And on February 11, 2019, they told their son that he had to enter treatment for his mental health and his substance use. What followed took place inside the house over the next 2 days. Richard Nicholson was confronted in the garage and fatally harmed. Kim Nicholson was fatally harmed a short time later. The following morning, Maria Morse, who was 57 and lived in Anaheim and had worked for the family for years, arrived for her regular shift and was fatally harmed as well. Camden then stayed in the house. He used his parents' vehicle over the following days, went on shopping trips, and stopped at a marijuana dispensary. On February 13th, he drove himself to a hospital in Irvine and told police officers there that he had ended his parents' lives. He was arrested that night. At what point does a family's ability to handle a crisis privately become the thing that guarantees nobody outside ever intervenes? The legal question in this case was never really whether he did it. He said he did within 2 days to police officers in a hospital, without a lawyer present and without being asked. The question was whether he was legally responsible, and California resolves that in 2 separate phases in front of the same jury. Nicholson pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, citing his schizoaffective disorder. The first phase established the facts. In October of 2025, after a trial that had taken more than 6 years to arrive, an Orange County jury convicted him on 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, including the multiple murder special circumstance that makes a defendant eligible for the harshest sentences California allows. The second phase was the sanity phase, and it asked a much narrower question than most people assume. Not whether he was mentally ill, which nobody disputed, but whether at the time of the acts he was capable of understanding what he was doing and that it was wrong. The same jury found him legally sane. That distinction is the entire case, and it gets misread constantly. A defendant can carry a serious psychiatric diagnosis, can have been floridly unwell for years, and can still be found sane under California's standard, because the standard asks about comprehension at the moment, rather than about diagnosis in general. The jury heard the schizoaffective disorder evidence in both phases. In the first phase, it convicted. In the second, it declined to excuse. Sentencing came on March 20th, 2026, before Orange County Superior Court Judge Michael Cassidy. His defense filed a motion for a new trial alleging juror misconduct, and the judge denied it. Nicholson was sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of life without the possibility of parole, with credit for 2,593 days already served. There was a civil dimension as well. Maria Morse had no connection to the family conflict at the center of this case. She had worked for the Nicholsons for years, and on the morning in question, she arrived for her shift the way she had arrived for hundreds of shifts before it. Her family filed a wrongful death suit against the estate of Richard and Kim Nicholson, which is a difficult and unusual posture, because the people being sued were also victims. Look at how long all of this took. The arrest was in February of 2019. The verdict came in October of 2025. 6.5 years passed between the two, most of it consumed by competency evaluations, psychiatric assessment, and the pandemic backlog in the California courts. As of 2026, Camden Burton Nicholson is in the custody of the California State Prison System, serving 3 consecutive life terms without parole. He will not be released. And the privilege at work here is not the kind that gets anybody out of anything. The gate, the address, and the family resources did not shorten a sentence or buy a better outcome. What they did was keep a young man's deterioration inside one household for years, visible to his parents and to a private investigator they paid, and to almost nobody else with the authority to act on it. Joshua Bagwell. He came from one of the wealthiest families in southern Oklahoma. His grandparents held some of the largest tracts of land in the region, and he had been given 6 new cars before he was old enough to fully appreciate any of them. When a young woman he knew vanished one autumn night, few in the town of Waurika imagined the answer led back to him. And even after the truth surfaced, he would remain the only one of 3 young men who never once admitted what he had done. She was a high school student in Waurika, a cheerleader and an honor student whose face was familiar to nearly everyone in the small community. On the night of October 2nd, 1996, she left home after a family argument to meet Bagwell. That decision was the last one she would ever make freely. The evening began with drinking, and it continued until she was badly intoxicated. Bagwell, then 17, was with two others, Curtis Allen Gamble, 19, a school dropout with a record, and Randy Wood, 17, the local homecoming king. What happened over the course of that night, the young men came to fear, could bring serious allegations against them. To keep her from telling anyone, they drove her across the state line to a bridge over Belknap Creek in Montague County, Texas, and there her life was taken. Her body was recovered from the water on October 10th. Her mother, Gail Rich, refused to wait for answers. She walked the town herself, taking note of which local boys had failed to appear at school, and two names kept surfacing, Wood and Bagwell. The investigation drew in an FBI agent named Phil Gadd and a Texas Ranger named Lane Akin, and it turned on something small and traceable, the ammunition Bagwell had recently purchased. When investigators pressed Gamble about the weapon, he broke and admitted that the three of them had been involved. How does a young man with 3 private attorneys and a family name that carried weight across the county end up facing the most serious charge the state can bring? The answer took shape in the courtroom. The district attorney, a prosecutor named Tim Cole, built the case around the account the 2 co-defendants would give, and one by one, the deals fell into place. Wood confessed early and accepted a plea, life imprisonment with parole eligibility after 30 years in exchange for his testimony. Gamble pleaded guilty to avoid a possible death sentence and agreed to testify as well. Bagwell alone never admitted guilt. He hired 3 private attorneys, among them a former district attorney named Jack McGaughey, who had once prosecuted cases in that very county, and the defense worked to shift scrutiny onto the young woman herself, putting her character on trial rather than answering for the night, a strategy her family and the prosecution bitterly resisted. Then the case turned. On the stand, Gamble reversed course and named Wood as the one who fired, and Wood, in response, gave up his own plea protection to testify to the truth. In February of 1998, after weighing the shifting accounts the 2 co-defendants had given, a jury convicted Bagwell of capital murder and conspiracy. The capital murder count carried an automatic term of life. For the conspiracy, the court added 99 years and a $10,000 fine. His story did not end at sentencing. In January of 2002, Bagwell and Gamble broke out of the Montague County Jail with 2 other men, took a hostage, and were recaptured only after a standoff at a gas station across the Oklahoma line, where they surrendered on February 7th. The breakout and the long trial that preceded it drew coverage far beyond the small towns where the story had unfolded. His later appeals reached the federal courts, where his lawyers argued a technical flaw in the kidnapping element of the case, contending that the young woman had first entered the vehicle willingly and was later beyond awareness. The courts were unmoved, and the district attorney stated publicly that he would not walk free regardless of the outcome. As of 2026, Joshua Bagwell remains in the custody of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Gamble, who received a second stacked life sentence for the conspiracy, becomes eligible for parole consideration in the autumn of 2026. Bagwell acted to bury the consequences of a single night. The next young man was not driven by panic at all. His motive was arithmetic, the value of an inheritance he was unwilling to wait for. Andrew Grant DeYoung. He was raised in a quiet, devoutly religious household outside Marietta, Georgia, the kind of family that drew little notice from anyone. Neighbors knew him as intelligent and reserved, but he had done the math on his parents' estate, and he had decided the money he stood to inherit was worth more to him than the people who had raised him. DeYoung, 19, was described in court as bright but withdrawn, a young man with distant relationships even inside his own home, described by some who knew him as a loner with an interest in the occult. He had come to estimate his parents' estate at roughly $480,000, and he wanted a share of it as seed money to launch a business. That pursuit of financial gain would later become one of the aggravating factors the jury weighed against him. His father, Gary DeYoung, and his mother, Catherine, were asleep at home the night everything changed. So were his younger sister and his teenage brother. It was an ordinary family in an ordinary house. In the early hours of June 14, 1993, DeYoung and an accomplice named David Michael Haggerty cut the telephone lines to the home, and DeYoung went inside. His mother was attacked first, then his father, whose life was taken as he tried to respond to the commotion. His younger sister came to the doorway and did not survive the night either. Haggerty had been assigned to see that the teenage brother downstairs did not live, but he lost his nerve, and that hesitation saved a life. The boy slipped out through a window and ran to a neighbor's house. A further plan, to set the home on fire and conceal what had happened, was abandoned. A neighbor, armed and alert to the disturbance, saw DeYoung fleeing in dark clothing. Later that morning, he returned home calm, showing no grief, with scratches across his face, neck, and hands. Haggerty soon confessed, led investigators to the discarded clothing and weapons, and agreed to testify for the state, an account that would place his friend at the center of the crime. What does a jury do with a young man who planned the loss of his entire family for the price of a business venture? In October of 1995, in Cobb County Superior Court, before Judge James Osborne, DeYoung was convicted on 3 counts of malice murder. In the sentencing phase, the jury weighed the aggravating factors, the pursuit of money and what it described as a depravity of mind, and recommended a sentence of death. Georgia law required the jury to find at least one aggravating circumstance before it could impose that penalty, and here it had found 2. Haggerty, who had turned state's evidence, pleaded guilty to 3 counts and received 3 consecutive life terms, a striking contrast for 2 young men who had entered the same house on the same night. DeYoung's appeals moved through the Georgia Supreme Court, which affirmed his conviction in 1997, and then through the federal courts, which denied his final petitions in 2010. On July 21, 2011, Andrew Grant DeYoung was put to death by lethal injection at the state prison in Jackson, Georgia, and was pronounced dead at 8:04 in the evening. His was the first execution in the United States recorded on video in nearly 2 decades. The order to record it came from a judge in Fulton County, at the request of another condemned prisoner, Gregory Walker, who wanted evidence for his own case about whether the sedative the state had recently adopted could cause unconstitutional suffering. The concern had sharpened after another Georgia execution only weeks earlier, in which the condemned man was seen to jerk and mutter as the drugs took hold. The footage was kept under seal. Georgia's Attorney General fought the order. The execution was pushed back a day. The state Supreme Court split 4-3 over whether to halt it, and the United States Supreme Court declined to step in. The only comparable recording dated back to 1992, when the gas chamber execution of a condemned man named Robert Alton Harris had been filmed in California, a tape that was afterward destroyed, which made DeYoung's the first lethal injection ever captured on film. He barely moved, and he was gone in less than 15 minutes. In his final moments, he said he was sorry for everyone he had hurt. As of 2026, his case remains one of the very few American executions ever recorded. DeYoung's crime was the product of careful planning and a clear, if monstrous, goal. The young man in the next case had no plan and no goal that anyone could name. He simply drove into a crowd. David Attias. On a February night in the college town of Isla Vista, California, a freshman drove his car at high speed down a street crowded with students. When it was over, 4 young people were gone. He climbed out of the wreck, raised his arms, and declared himself to be the angel of death. David Attias, 18, was the son of the prominent Hollywood television director Daniel Attias, who had directed episodes of a long string of well-known series. On campus at the University of California, Santa Barbara, his erratic behavior had already earned him the grim nickname of Crazy Dave among his dorm mates. Behind it lay a documented history of mental illness that reached back into childhood. By some accounts, he had spent time in psychiatric care as a young boy, following an incident involving a family member. The four who lost their lives that night were Nicholas Bordakis, Christopher Divis, and Ruth Levy, all 20, and Ailey Israel, who was 27. Ruth's brother, Albert Levy, was gravely injured that same night, and he lived with the consequences for roughly 15 years before passing from related complications in 2016. A fifth life ultimately claimed by a single minute on that street. They were students and young adults out on an ordinary evening, and none of them were strangers to the campus that would spend years grieving them. On the night of February 23, 2001, Atias accelerated his car into pedestrians along a busy Isla Vista street. Toxicology later identified substances in his system that investigators concluded were not significant to the crash. It remained one of the darkest nights the student community had known, and what lingered afterward was the question of his mind. When a young man causes so much loss and cannot be shown to have understood what he was doing, what is a court supposed to do with him? Atias pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, and his trial, argued by the prosecutor Patrick McKinley and the defense attorney Jack Early, unfolded in 2 stages, as such cases do in California. In the first stage, the jury decided what he had done. In June of 2002, it convicted him of 4 counts of second-degree murder and acquitted him of driving under the influence. In the second stage, the same jury decided the state of his mind, and it found him legally insane. That verdict changed everything about what came next. Rather than a prison term, he was committed to Patton State Hospital under an indeterminate commitment that could stretch up to 60 years. A finding of insanity is not an acquittal in the ordinary sense. It removes the fixed sentence entirely and places a person under the control of the state's mental health system, where the length of confinement depends on clinical judgment rather than a number handed down at sentencing. For the families of the 4 he had struck down, that meant there would be no fixed term to mark and no release date to count toward, only a series of hearings reaching indefinitely into the future. That is why his path since has looked so different from the others in this account. In September of 2012, after roughly a decade, Atias was conditionally released into a state-supervised outpatient program known as CONREP, rather than set free, settling in the city of Oxnard and subject to ongoing monitoring and periodic review by the court. In early 2022, around the 21st anniversary of the crime, he petitioned to have his legal sanity formally restored, a step that would have ended that supervision. That March, a judge named Thomas Adams denied the petition, ruling that he had not advanced far enough through the program's stages, that he remained at a supportive level of care, and had not reached the transitional stage discharge would require. Under California's rules, a person in his position can end that supervision only by persuading a court that their sanity has been restored, and Atias has not yet cleared that bar. As of 2026, David Atias remains in that supervised program, neither fully free nor behind prison walls. Atias's fate rested on the state of his mind. The next case rests on the state of a household, and it complicates the very idea of the untouchable rich teenager, because this young man was neither rich nor untouchable. Anthony Template. He grew up almost entirely cut off from the world, kept out of school and away from other children, watched constantly through cameras and tracking software on his phone. When he was 17, an argument with his father turned physical, and he reached for a gun. Then he called for help himself and told the dispatcher plainly that he had just taken his father's life. This case is the exception among these stories, and it matters that it is told as one. Anthony Templet does not fit the picture of a pampered child who expected to escape consequences. The record in his case describes something else entirely: a documented history of abuse, isolation, and neglect. According to the defense, his father had taken him from his mother when he was very young, denied him an education, and controlled nearly every movement of his daily life. What looked from the outside like a sudden act of violence carried a long and painful history behind it. The man who lost his life was Bert Templet, 53, Anthony's father. On June 3, 2019, a confrontation over Anthony's phone escalated. Anthony retrieved a weapon, and his father was fatally wounded, passing 3 days later. It was in the hours and days after that call, as investigators pieced together the household Anthony had been living in, that the fuller picture began to surface, and the question shifted from what he had done to why he had been raised the way he was. How does a justice system weigh a young man's actions when the life he ended was also, by many accounts, the source of years of harm against him? The charges themselves tell the story of a system trying to find the right measure. Prosecutors first brought a manslaughter charge, a count that acknowledges a life lost without the intent required for the gravest offense. A grand jury then indicted him on the more serious count of second-degree murder. But in March of 2021, the case resolved on the lightest of those three footings. Anthony pleaded no contest to negligent homicide, and he was sentenced not to prison, but to 5 years of supervised probation, with credit for the time he had already served. The conditions required him to earn his high school equivalency, attend counseling, and maintain steady work or schooling, and his record was left eligible for expungement. The prosecutor, Dana Cummings, acknowledged the reports of abuse in open court. The defense had made that history the center of its case, and the story soon reached a national audience through a widely viewed Netflix documentary released in 2022 that framed him less as an offender than as a survivor, and it turned a Louisiana homicide case into a national conversation about what a childhood of total control can produce. Yet his story did not settle into the quiet resolution that ending seemed to promise. In July of 2025, he was pulled over for a window tint violation, and officers reported finding marijuana and an open bottle of alcohol in the vehicle, along with a teenage passenger. He was charged with intent to distribute an open container violation and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. His bond was set at $75,000. By October of that year, his attorney, Jarrett Ambeau, said he could not post even the roughly $8,000 a bondsman would require, despite the fact that he had earlier received around $100,000 in online donations. Money, the attorney indicated, had run out. He had been living largely on those contributions, and he was set to be sentenced on the new charges that same month, with his lawyer expecting the court to credit the time he had already spent in custody. As of 2026, Anthony Templet is once again in custody. Anthony Templet was controlled through deprivation. The next young man in this stretch of stories was controlled through excess, given nearly everything he asked for, and living a lie so elaborate that it ended in the quiet village where his family believed they were safe. Brian Blackwell. In an affluent village near Liverpool, an 18-year-old straight-A student had a place waiting for him at medical school. He also had a hidden life, a fabricated career as a professional tennis player, complete with an invented sponsorship from the sportswear giant Nike, all funded on his father's credit. When his parents finally confronted him about the spending, he did not confess. He made certain the questions would stop. Brian Blackwell was the only child of a retired accountant and a former antiques dealer, raised in comfort in the village of Melling. On paper, he was an exceptional student, a scholarship boy at Liverpool College with a place secured to study medicine at the University of Nottingham. In private, he was a compulsive liar who had built an entire fantasy around himself, claiming a professional tennis career and a lucrative sponsorship, and spending lavishly on credit to sustain it. There was a thin thread of truth beneath the fiction, for he had genuinely been a junior tennis champion at his local club, but the professional career and the sponsorship were pure invention. The team of psychiatrists who later examined him would reach a unanimous conclusion about the disorder driving that behavior. His parents, Sydney, 72, and Jacqueline, 61, were at the family bungalow on the summer day their son's double life collided with reality. On July 25, 2004, during an argument over his spending and a planned trip to the United States, Blackwell attacked both of his parents at their home, and both of them lost their lives. The very next day, he flew to the United States with his girlfriend, who knew nothing of what had happened, on an extravagant holiday paid for with his father's credit cards. When he returned, he stayed at her home, telling her he was locked out while his parents holidayed in Spain. The bodies would not be discovered until early September, on the 5th, when neighbors reported an odor coming from the property. The senior detective who led the case would later say that Blackwell had weighed his parents' lives against the fantasy he had built, and had chosen the fantasy. How does a court judge a young man who could carry out such an act and then board a plane for a luxury vacation as though nothing at all had occurred? The answer became a landmark in British law. At Liverpool Crown Court in 2005, before Mr. Justice Royce and with David Steer prosecuting, the 5 specialists who had examined Blackwell agreed unanimously that he suffered from narcissistic personality disorder. The prosecution suggested that his parents had discovered the truth about his spending and tried to stop the American trip, and that their objection had set off the rage that followed. Under English law, a person who takes a life while their mental responsibility is substantially impaired may be convicted of manslaughter rather than the graver charge, a doctrine known as diminished responsibility. On that basis, the original double charge was reduced after he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and his case became one of the first in which narcissistic personality disorder was accepted as the foundation for such a plea, a point that drew considerable attention in legal circles. Because of his case, narcissistic personality disorder came to be treated in British law as a serious mitigating circumstance. On June 29, 2005, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 12 years. That minimum is not a release date, but a threshold, the earliest point at which his case could even be considered, and the judge remarked that, on the evidence then before the court, it seemed unlikely he would ever be found fit for release. That prediction did not hold. Blackwell served roughly 12 years, held first at Swinfen Hall, a young offenders institution, before he was transferred into the adult prison system as he aged into it. Once he passed the minimum term the court had set, his case went before the parole board, and following an oral hearing at which his risk was assessed, he was granted release on parole in 2016, the very outcome the sentencing judge had thought improbable. As of 2026, he remains a free man, his identity and whereabouts largely shielded from public view. Blackwell boarded a plane and lived out a lavish holiday as though his parents were still waiting behind him. That same unsettling calm, the ability to step back into an ordinary evening moments after shattering one, runs through the next case as well, in a teenager who did what he did and then rejoined his friends as if it were any other night. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Nicholas Browning. He was an honor student and a Boy Scout on the verge of earning the highest rank scouting offers, a varsity athlete at a well-regarded high school, the son of a successful attorney. Classmates would later remember something else about him. He had complained more than once about his father's money and his father's rules, and he had joked more than once, about what he might one day do about it. Nicholas Browning, 15, was the eldest son of an affluent family in Cockeysville, Maryland, a suburb north of Baltimore. His father was a respected attorney, and his mother a homemaker and former School Parents Association president, and Nicholas himself, a student at Dulaney High School, where he played golf and lacrosse, looked on paper like a model young man. Yet beneath that surface ran a current of resentment that his classmates had noticed, and that prosecutors would later point to directly. In their account, his motive came down to two things: a refusal to be told what to do, and an unwillingness to share what he expected to inherit. His father, John Browning, 45, and his mother, Tamara, 44, were at home that night with their two younger sons. It was, to every outward appearance, a settled and successful household. None of them saw what was coming. Overnight, between the 1st and 2nd of February, 2008, Nicholas left a friend's house after midnight, having arranged for one of his younger brothers to leave a door unlocked. He took his father's handgun. As the household slept, the lives of his father, his mother, and both of his younger brothers were taken. He then discarded the weapon in a wooded area, returned to his friend's house, and rejoined the evening as though nothing had happened. The family was found the following day. The account he offered began to come apart almost at once, and on the 3rd of February, Nicholas confessed and directed investigators to where the weapon could be found. At a hearing before trial, a defense psychiatrist named Neil Blumberg testified that he had been in a dissociative state that night, his consciousness and memory disrupted, and that relatives and friends had reported abuse within the home and a family history of alcoholism. The judge, Thomas Bullinger, ruled that evidence of his mental condition alone was not enough to move the case into juvenile court. State experts disagreed that he suffered from any mental illness, and because of his youth, a death sentence was never a possibility. What sentence fits a young man who took the lives of everyone in his home and then rejoined his friends as if it were any other night? In October of 2008, Nicholas Browning pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder. On the 23rd of January 2009, he was sentenced to 4 life terms, 2 of them ordered to run consecutively, a structure meant to hold him for the greater share of his life. At sentencing, prosecutors played a jailhouse phone call in which he had joked about breaking out of prison, set against the tears with which he told his relatives he was sorry and that words could not describe what he had done. One prosecutor remarked that everyone in the household had been lost except the single person who stood to gain by it. Years later, his attorneys returned to court, arguing that access to a youth offender program might one day open a path to parole. The judge refused. He remains in the custody of the Maryland prison system, held at the Jessup Correctional Institution. With credit for good behavior, he could reach parole eligibility around 2031, though eligibility is not release, and any such decision would fall to a parole board weighing 4 lost lives against whatever the years have made of him. In the years since, he has had few visitors beyond a pen pal who began writing to him in prison and came to see him regularly. As of 2026, Nicholas Browning is still incarcerated. Browning's undoing came from his own account, a confession given within days. The next case also hinged on the words of the person responsible, but those words were designed to sound like innocence, a call for help placed by someone who had just taken part in the very death she was reporting. Daphne Abdella and Christopher Vasquez. One was the adopted daughter of a wealthy food industry executive, raised in a lavish apartment beside Central Park. The other was a shy former altar boy from a working-class neighborhood uptown. On a spring night in 1997, the two of them left a man's body in the Central Park lake, and the call meant to report it anonymously would lead police straight back to her door. Daphne Abdella, 15, had grown up with every advantage. Her adoptive father, Angelo Abdella, was an executive in the food distribution business, and the family lived in comfort near the park. She was also a deeply troubled teenager, expelled from private school, with a documented history of drinking and behavioral problems. Christopher Vasquez, also 15, came from an entirely different world, a working-class family in Spanish Harlem, a quiet former altar boy who had struggled with anxiety since childhood. Only one of them fit the picture of the pampered rich teenager, and it is worth keeping that distinction clear, because the night would bind their names together regardless. Michael McMorrow, 44, was a Manhattan real estate agent. Abdella knew him from a support group the two of them attended. On the night of May 22, 1997, McMorrow had been drinking with the teenagers near the lake. What began as a night of drinking at the water's edge ended with McMorrow's life being taken. The two teenagers then tried to conceal what they had done, leaving his body in the lake in the hope it would sink and never surface. It surfaced the next day. In the hours afterward, Abdella placed a call to emergency services that she appears to have intended as an anonymous tip. The call was traced to her family's residence, and when officers arrived, they found the two teenagers washing away blood. In the account she offered, Abdella said a companion had gone into the lake and not come back out, though detectives felt her distress seemed rehearsed. She then gave information that led investigators to Vasquez, and the weapon was recovered from his apartment. When two teenagers stand accused in the same death, how does a court decide who carries which share of the blame? Both 15-year-olds were charged as adults and indicted for second-degree murder, a measure of how gravely the city treated the case. And both at first pleaded not guilty. From there, their paths split. From the very start, Abdella's attorney, George Weinbaum, worked to cast her as a witness rather than an accomplice. And she met with investigators repeatedly through the second half of 1997. In March of 1998, she pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter, and the following month, she was sentenced to a term of 3 1/3 to 10 years. At that hearing, she told the court she could never put into words how sorry she was. Vasquez refused to plead. He went to trial, where the case against him rested entirely on circumstantial evidence. And in 1999, a jury convicted him of first-degree manslaughter as well. Each faced a maximum of roughly 10 years, an outcome that struck many observers as strikingly light for a life lost. Both were released in 2004. Abdella's years after prison were far from settled. She drew further legal trouble, including an arrest on a harassment charge, along with periodic difficulties on parole, that at one point sent her back behind bars for a violation. Vasquez, for his part, stepped almost completely out of public view. Both were reported to have stayed in the New York area. As of 2026, each has long since finished serving time and lives as a free adult, their names surfacing now mainly in accounts of a case that, splashed across the city's tabloids at the time, became one of the most closely followed crimes of its decade, and whose two principals the papers went on tracking for years afterward. Abdella's family money could not keep her name off the indictment, yet she had let another set of hands carry out the worst of that night. The young man in the next case took that idea further still, arranging a death entirely at a distance and making certain he was miles away when it arrived. Chris Pritchard. He was the stepson of a man who had just come into a small fortune. He was also a failing college student who spent his nights on fantasy games and hallucinogens, and he had persuaded two friends to help him claim that fortune years ahead of schedule. The plan came down to a house key, a hand-drawn map, and an alibi built miles away. Christopher Pritchard, about 19, was drifting through North Carolina State University, deep into a popular fantasy role-playing game and a habit of hallucinogenic drugs. His stepfather, Leith von Stein, was an executive at a textile firm who had recently inherited a fortune worth close to $2 million, its wealth built on a family dry cleaning chain in Winston-Salem. That money was the whole of Pritchard's motive. With his stepfather and his mother gone, he would inherit, and he set about arranging exactly that. Leith von Stein, 42, was the intended target of the plan. Pritchard's mother, Bonnie, was gravely wounded in the same attack, but survived it. Their home sat in a quiet subdivision, the kind of place where violence of this sort was almost unimaginable. Earlier schemes had come to nothing: a staged electrical fire and a planned attack, machete in hand, that was called off before it began. So Pritchard settled on something direct. In the pre-dawn hours of July 25, 1988, in the Smallwood subdivision of Washington, North Carolina, he handed one accomplice, a young man named James Upchurch, a key to the family home and a map he had sketched by hand, while a second, Neil Henderson, drove Upchurch to the house. Inside, von Stein's life was taken, and Bonnie was gravely injured, and all the while Pritchard sat on his university campus, assembling the appearance of an ordinary night. Suspicion moved toward the family once the size of the estate came to light, and Pritchard's refusal to sit for a polygraph did nothing to ease it. He had insisted he was on campus the whole night, but the story did not hold. And when investigators recovered the partly burned map, they recognized his handwriting. His mother, still recovering from her injuries, at first could not believe that her son had played any part in it. Then a farmer reported a fire in a rural stretch of countryside, and investigators recovered the remains of a knife, burned clothing, and a partly burned map of the very neighborhood where the attack had taken place. It was nearly a year before any arrests were made. Henderson, unable to carry the secret while working as an assistant manager at a fast food restaurant in Virginia, finally walked into a police station and confessed, and the case came apart. How do you prove that the young man with the most airtight alibi was, in fact, the one who set the whole thing in motion? The proof came from his own co-conspirators. In January of 1990, Pritchard and Henderson pleaded guilty to reduced charges and testified against Upchurch, the man who had gone inside. Upchurch was convicted of first-degree murder and condemned to death, but a flaw in the instructions given to the jury during the penalty phase forced a new sentencing hearing in 1993, and his sentence became life. Henderson, who by the state's records committed not a single infraction during his years inside, received 40 years and was paroled in December of 2000. Pritchard himself was convicted of aiding and abetting second-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, with a further 20 years for the attack on his mother. The case drew national attention and became the basis for two widely read books, one called Cruel Doubt and the other Blood Games, both later adapted for television. Chris Pritchard was paroled on June 2, 2007. In the years since, he reportedly reconciled with his mother, Bonnie, the very woman who had survived the attack he helped set in motion. A reconciliation that startled many who had followed the case and became a devout Christian who now works helping formerly incarcerated people find their footing on the outside. Upchurch, the man who actually entered the home, remained in prison. As of 2026, Pritchard lives as a free man. His story an uneasy meditation on the distance between the crime a person arranges and the person he may later become. Pritchard's motive was money, cold and uncomplicated. The two young men in the next case would hand the court something far harder to weigh, not greed at all, but the claim that what happened had grown out of a home that had become impossible to bear. Nathan Ibanez and Eric Jensen. They were best friends and bandmates, two teenagers from a comfortable corner of suburban Colorado. One of them took his mother's life inside the family apartment, and the other stayed behind to help. Both were sentenced to die in prison, and both, more than 2 decades later, walked out. Nathan Ibanez, 16, and Eric Jensen, 17, were close friends who played together in a punk band called Troublebound that rehearsed at Jensen's family home, a large house in an affluent part of the Denver area. Jensen was the son of a successful venture capitalist. Ibanez told a far darker story about his own household, alleging a long history of severe abuse by his parents, a claim that would shadow the case for years to come. Julie Ibanez, Nathan's mother, lost her life on June 5, 1998, in the family's apartment in Highlands Ranch. She was, to those outside the home, an ordinary suburban mother. What went on within it would be argued over long after her passing. During a confrontation that day, Nathan took his mother's life. Eric was present, and in the aftermath, he helped conceal what had happened and dispose of her body. Nathan was discovered as he unloaded her body from the trunk of her car. Both were charged with and convicted of first-degree murder. Jensen was tried first in August of 1999 and convicted under Colorado's theory of complicity, the principle that a person who knowingly helps carry out a crime can be held as accountable as the one who commits it. His claim that marijuana had impaired him was rejected. Plea negotiations, by several accounts, had fallen apart in the charged atmosphere that followed the Columbine shooting, which had happened nearby only months earlier and had hardened attitudes toward young offenders throughout the state. In the end, both received what the law then demanded: life in prison with no possibility of parole. For two teenagers who had started a band together, it was an almost unimaginable place to end up. But should a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old be told at the very start of adulthood that he will die behind bars, no matter what he might one day become? The law itself would eventually answer that question. In 2012, the United States Supreme Court held, in Miller v. Alabama, that mandatory life without parole for juveniles was unconstitutional. That ruling reopened both cases. Rather than let the courts grind through them, two successive Colorado governors stepped in. In December of 2018, on his way out of office, Governor John Hickenlooper commuted Ibanez's sentence, citing both the abuse Ibanez said he had endured and his record as a model prisoner, and making him eligible for parole 2 years later. At a resentencing hearing that same year, ordered under the Colorado law that followed the Miller decision, a Douglas County judge had already converted Jensen's term to life with a parole bid possible after 40 years. And Jensen, weeping in court, said he had sat only a few feet from a dying woman and failed to save her when he could have. A year after Ibanez's commutation, Governor Jared Polis commuted Jensen's sentence as well, noting the more than 21 years he had already served, and clearing the way for his release almost at once. Eric Jensen, who had earned a college degree behind bars and started counseling and fitness programs for fellow inmates at the Lyman Correctional Facility, was released around March of 2020. Nathan Ibanez followed after his own parole eligibility arrived that December. In the years since, Ibanez has been described as living freely in Colorado, married, working as a paralegal, and writing and publishing poetry. As of 2026, both men, once condemned to spend their entire lives in prison, are free. The shift in the law that released those two, the growing recognition that youth should count against a sentence of permanent confinement, was not yet finished with the American courtroom. In the final case, that same principle would surface once more in 2026 in Massachusetts, and it would unsettle a sentence that had appeared entirely beyond appeal. Nathaniel Fujita. He was a high school football star with an early college acceptance in hand, raised in one of the wealthier suburbs west of Boston. Weeks after his girlfriend ended their relationship, he asked her to stop by his house while his parents were away. She parked where the car could not be seen, walked inside, and never came out. Years later, a court would rule that even a sentence of life without parole could not be allowed to stand. Nathaniel Fujita, 18, came from the affluent town of Wayland, Massachusetts. He had been a standout on his high school football team and had earned early acceptance to Trinity College. His family carried a history of mental illness, a fact that would sit at the center of his defense. Lauren Astley, 18, was his former girlfriend, a recent high school graduate on her way to Elon University. She was a gifted singer, widely liked, standing at the very start of her adult life. She and Fujita had dated through high school, and only weeks before that summer night, she had chosen to end things. On the 3rd of July, 2011, Fujita asked Lauren to come by his home while his parents were out, telling her to leave her car where it would not be noticed. Inside, her life was taken. He then concealed her body in a marsh, cleaned the scene, and hid his blood-stained clothing. She was found the following day. Investigators recovered wet, blood-stained clothing hidden in a crawlspace in his bedroom. His defense, led by an attorney named William Sullivan, argued that he had not been criminally responsible, that he had suffered a psychotic break brought on by major depression and the first stirrings of schizophrenia, perhaps compounded by repeated head trauma from football and by daily marijuana use. The prosecutor, Lisa McGovern, answered that this was rage over a breakup, carried out with careful premeditation, and told the jury bluntly that there was no such thing as a convenient psychosis that appears at the exact moment it is needed to excuse what a person has done. How much weight should a court give to the state of a young man's mind when everything around the act looked so deliberate? In March of 2013, in Middlesex Superior Court, before Judge Peter Laureat, a jury convicted Fujita of first-degree murder on theories of both deliberate premeditation and extreme atrocity or cruelty, along with several counts of assault. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. A motion for a new trial was denied in 2023, the judge concluding that the evidence overwhelmingly supported the verdict. Then, on January 8, 2026, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, in a unanimous opinion written by Justice Serge Georges, affirmed his conviction, finding the evidence of his criminal responsibility overwhelming. The court pointed to the deliberate steps he had taken before, during, and after closing the garage door and staging the theft of her car as the actions of a rational mind working to frustrate justice, and it observed that not every person who suffers from mental illness lacks responsibility for what he does. But the same court could not let his sentence remain as it was. Because Fujita had been younger than 21 when he took Lauren's life, and because a recent state ruling known as the Mattis decision had extended to young adults under that age the protections once reserved for juveniles, the court held that life without parole was unconstitutional in his case, and it returned the matter for resentencing to a term that would make him eligible for parole after 15 years. As the court's own opinion acknowledged, that could, in theory, make him eligible for parole in the very year of the ruling. As of 2026, Nathaniel Fujita remains incarcerated while he awaits resentencing, and no date for that hearing had yet been set. Lauren's mother has said she cannot understand why he should be allowed an ordinary life when her daughter was denied one of her own. And in one of the most quietly remarkable moments of the original trial, Lauren's father crossed the courtroom after the verdict to embrace Fujita's parents, and he went on to help build a fund in his daughter's name, the Lauren Dunn Astley Memorial Fund, which has since directed some $300,000 toward programs that teach young people, starting in grade school, what a healthy relationship should look like. A mural painted by her friends still stands at her old high school. 10 young people who believed, each in their own way, that money or circumstance would place them beyond the reach of what they had done. Some were right for a while, and some were wrong from the very first morning. But nearly all of them came to learn that the law, however slowly it moves, tends in the end to arrive. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.